The October morning arrived at Hogwarts with a kind of golden light that made even the oldest stones seem warm. In the East Tower, where a small dormitory window overlooked the castle grounds, a third-year student named Thomas Whitmore pressed his nose against the cold glass and watched the mist rise from the greenhouses below. The vapor curled upward in lazy spirals, backlit by the climbing sun, and Thomas could just make out the silhouette of Professor Sprout moving between the glass structures like a devoted gardener tending to sleeping giants. His stomach tightened with anticipation. Today was the day, the Mandrake lesson. Professor Sprout had mentioned it last week in passing, her round face creasing with that particular smile she reserved for plants she found especially fascinating. "Next Thursday," she'd said, patting soil from her hands onto her patched robes, "we'll be working with something truly remarkable. Do bring your concentration, dears, and perhaps a bit of courage." Thomas had thought about little else since. He pulled away from the window and glanced at his roommate, Peter Kenning, who was still buried beneath his quilts despite the morning light flooding their room. The Hufflepuff dormitory had a way of making students want to stay in bed. All golden wood and soft fabrics, with the perpetual smell of toast somehow drifting up from the kitchens below. The house elves, Thomas knew, kept fires going in the common room all night, banking them carefully so the warmth seeped through the floorboards. It was the kind of comfort that made early October mornings particularly challenging. "Pete," Thomas said, keeping his voice low, "it's nearly 8. A grunt emerged from the quilts. "Herbology today, the Mandrakes. This produced results." Peter's head appeared, his sandy hair sticking up at odd angles. "That's today." His eyes were wide now, sleep forgotten. "Bloody hell, I thought we had another week." "Thursday," she said, "Thursday. It's Thursday." Peter scrambled out of bed with the graceless urgency of someone who just remembered an appointment with destiny, or at least with something that could render you unconscious with its screaming. Thomas couldn't help but smile. Peter approached most of magical education with a sort of cheerful terror, equal parts excited and convinced that everything would somehow go catastrophically wrong. So far, he'd managed to set fire to only 2 cauldrons and accidentally transfigure his quill into a rather aggressive sparrow. For Peter, this counted as success. They dressed quickly, pulling on the comfortable work robes that Professor Sprout insisted upon for practical lessons. Thomas had learned, in his 3 years at Hogwarts, that different professors had different standards. Professor McGonagall expected pristine uniforms and perfect posture. Professor Flitwick didn't mind a bit of dishevelment, as long as your wand work was precise. But Professor Sprout actively encouraged clothing that could withstand dirt, water, dragon dung fertilizer, and the occasional splash of something that might or might not be sentient. The common room was already emptying as they descended the earthen steps. A few 7th years sat by the fire, books spread across their laps, looking exhausted in that particular way that came with NEWT preparation. One of them, a tall girl named Margaret, whom Thomas vaguely knew from Quidditch matches, looked up and smiled tiredly. "Off to meet the Mandrakes?" she asked. Thomas nodded, trying to look confident. "They're not so bad," Margaret said, though her smile suggested she was remembering something either very funny or mildly traumatic. "Just remember, keep the earmuffs on properly." Last year, Roger Caldwell thought he was being clever, wanted to hear what they actually sounded like. Spent 3 days in the hospital wing. Peter made a small noise that might have been a whimper. The great hall hummed with morning conversation when they entered. Enchanted candles floated overhead, despite the sunlight streaming through the high windows. Professor Flitwick's doing, Thomas suspected, because the castle's regular lighting charms sometimes took a while to adjust to seasonal changes. The 4 house tables stretched long and inviting, laden with breakfast dishes that steamed gently in the autumn air. Thomas and Peter found seats at the Hufflepuff table, squeezing in between a group of first years who were having an animated discussion about whether the giant squid in the lake could understand English. Thomas reached for toast and marmalade, his usual breakfast, but found his hand hesitating over the serving dishes. His appetite had transformed into something more like nervous energy, coiling in his stomach like a spring wound too tight. "You need to eat," Peter said, piling his own plate, with what appeared to be everything within reach. "Can't repot mandrakes on an empty stomach." "That's just asking for trouble." "Is that a real rule? Or are you making it up? Does it matter? Eat." Thomas compromised with toast and pumpkin juice, chewing slowly while his eyes drifted toward the staff table. Professor Sprout sat between Professor Flitwick and Professor McGonagall, her witch's hat slightly askew, talking with evident enthusiasm about something that required considerable hand gestures, probably plants. With Professor Sprout, it was almost always plants. There was something deeply reassuring about her presence. In a castle where portraits gossiped, staircases moved according to their own mysterious preferences, and suits of armor occasionally decided to relocate themselves for reasons known only to medieval metalwork, Professor Sprout represented a kind of earthbound stability. She spoke to plants the way other people spoke to beloved pets. She had soil perpetually under her fingernails. She never seemed rushed or flustered, even when Devil's Snare got loose in Greenhouse 2, or when Venomous Tentacula decided to redecorate during the middle of a lesson. Thomas found this comforting, especially on a morning when he was about to handle plants that could kill him with sound. The post arrived with its usual chaos of beating wings and scattered feathers. Owls swooped through the enchanted ceiling, which today showed a perfectly blue October sky with just a few clouds arranged like sheep on a distant hillside, dropping letters and packages with varying degrees of accuracy. A small tawny owl landed directly in Peter's porridge, looking affronted when Peter gently extracted it and offered a bit of bacon by way of apology. Thomas's own owl, a dignified barn owl named Archimedes, landed with considerably more grace, extending one leg with a letter attached. Thomas recognized his mother's handwriting immediately. Neat, careful letters that somehow managed to convey warmth even in ink. "Dearest Thomas, your father and I were delighted to receive your last letter. We're so pleased that Charms is going well and that Professor Flitwick has praised your levitation work. Your grandmother says to remind you that her side of the family has always had a talent for charms, though your father insists his side is better at practical magic. They've been arguing about it for 3 days now, very pleasantly. I'm enclosing some of those biscuits you like, the ones with ginger. The house elf who delivers to Hogsmeade has promised to keep them fresh, though I suspect magic will do most of the work. Try not to eat them all at once. Your father wants me to tell you that if you're working with mandrakes in herbology, you should listen very carefully to Professor Sprout's instructions. He says he still remembers his own mandrake lesson, though he's being mysterious about the details. Knowing your father, that probably means something embarrassing happened. Right soon, darling. We miss you terribly, though we're very proud. All our love, Mum. Thomas smiled, carefully folding the letter and tucking it into his robe pocket. His parents were both magical. His father worked in the Department of Magical Transportation. His mother managed a small shop in Diagon Alley that sold enchanted household items, but neither of them had quite lost their wonder at having a child at Hogwarts. Their letters always carried a mixture of parental concern and genuine fascination with his studies. The biscuits, wrapped in brown paper with a minor preservation charm that made them feel slightly warm, went into his bag. Peter eyed them hopefully. Later, Thomas promised. After we survive the mandrakes. If we survive the mandrakes. When? When we survive the mandrakes. The morning seemed determined to be beautiful. As students began migrating toward their first lessons, sunlight poured through the high windows in great golden shafts, illuminating dust motes and making the enchanted armor gleam. A group of portraits near the main staircase had apparently decided to visit each other, and Thomas caught a glimpse of a 17th century witch climbing between frames, her painted robes trailing behind her as she complained loudly about the declining quality of modern portraiture. The path to the greenhouses wound through grounds that were just beginning to show autumn's touch. The beech tree near the lake had started turning copper. The grass, still green but less vibrant than summer's lush growth, crunched slightly underfoot where morning frost had lingered in shadows. Thomas and Peter walked with a small cluster of other third years, a mix of Hufflepuffs and Ravenclaws, since herbology classes often combined houses for practical work. Sarah Chen, a Ravenclaw with a perpetually thoughtful expression, fell into step beside them. She carried her textbook, the Handbook of Intermediate Herbology, clutched against her chest like a shield. "I've been reading ahead," she announced, which surprised no one. Sarah approached every subject with the intensity of someone preparing for battle. Mandrakes are actually fascinating from a historical perspective. They've been used in potions since ancient times, particularly in restorative drafts. The mature plant's roots can kill you with screaming, Peter interrupted. "We know. That's the bit I'm concerned about. The mature plants can. These are babies. Their cry is only strong enough to knock someone unconscious for a few hours." Sarah said this as if it was somehow reassuring. "Only unconscious," Peter muttered. "Brilliant. That's much better." The greenhouses came into view. 3 large glass structures arranged in a row like transparent caterpillars sunning themselves. Greenhouse 1, where they had most of their regular lessons, stood furthest from the castle. Greenhouse 2, rumored to house more dangerous specimens, had reinforced glass and what looked like additional protective charms shimmering around its frame. Greenhouse 3, according to whispered student lore, contained plants that required special ministry permits and Professor Sprout's constant supervision. Today, however, they were headed to Greenhouse 3. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. A group of students had already gathered outside the entrance, their voices creating a low hum of nervous excitement. Thomas recognized most of them. Fellow third years he'd shared classes with for 3 years now. Faces that had become familiar through countless herbology lessons and shared disasters. There was Marcus Webb, tall and gangly, who had once accidentally fed his pet toad to a venomous tentacula. Diana Rosewood, who could identify any magical plant by smell alone. Timothy Gordon, whose primary talent seemed to be asking questions at precisely the moment everyone else had moved on. Professor Sprout emerged from the greenhouse, and the nervous chatter quieted immediately. She looked exactly as she always did, comfortably stout, her patched hat perched at its usual precarious angle, her face creased with smile lines that suggested a lifetime of finding joy in growing things. Her hands, Thomas noticed, were already dirt-stained, despite the early hour. She'd probably been in the greenhouses since dawn, preparing. "Good morning, dear ones," she said, her voice carrying that warm, slightly distracted quality that made students simultaneously feel welcome and mildly concerned about what was coming next. "Beautiful day for it, isn't it? The sun's just right, and I've been up since 6, getting everything prepared. Now, before we go inside, I want to make absolutely certain you all understand what we're doing today." She surveyed them with eyes that were sharp despite their kindness. Thomas had learned that Professor Sprout might look like everyone's favorite grandmother, but she took student safety seriously. Last year, when Benjamin Winters had tried to handle bouncing bulbs without gloves, she'd given him a detention that involved re-alphabetizing the entire storage shed by Latin names. Benjamin now wore double gloves to every lesson. "Mandrakes," Professor Sprout continued, "are among the most useful plants in magical horticulture. The mature root can be made into a restorative draught, capable of reviving those who have been petrified or cursed. They're essential to the healing arts. They're also," and here her expression became very serious, "extremely dangerous if handled improperly." The students shifted, excitement mixing with a healthy dose of fear. The cry of an adult mandrake will kill anyone who hears it. The cry of the juvenile plants we'll be working with today will merely render you unconscious for several hours, long enough for Madame Pomfrey to become quite irritated with me and for you to miss lunch, which would be a terrible shame given that I believe the house elves are preparing shepherd's pie." A few nervous laughs rippled through the group. "Therefore," Professor Sprout reached into a large basket beside the greenhouse door, "we will be using these." She held up a pair of thick, fluffy earmuffs, pink and somewhat absurd looking. "They've been charmed for maximum sound suppression. You will keep them on at all times. You will not, under any circumstances, remove them to see what the mandrakes sound like. You will not adjust them because they're uncomfortable. You will not take them off because you think you're being careful. Am I understood?" A chorus of "Yes." Professor answered her. "Excellent. We'll also be using dragonhide gloves because mandrake roots, even young ones, can give you quite a nasty bite if they're feeling irritable. And baby mandrakes," she smiled fondly, as if discussing mischievous puppies, "are almost always feeling irritable. They don't enjoy being moved." She distributed earmuffs with brisk efficiency, followed by thick gloves that smelled faintly of dragon, a leathery, sulphurous scent that Thomas found oddly comforting. They were tools of the trade, after all, protection against the wonderful, terrible things that magical plants could do. Now then, Professor Sprout surveyed her class with evident satisfaction. "Let's go meet our mandrakes," Shall we? She pushed open the greenhouse door, and warm, humid air rolled out to meet them, rich with the smell of earth, growing things, and something else, something slightly acrid and wild. Thomas followed her inside, Peter close at his heels, and felt his breath catch. Greenhouse 3 was larger than it appeared from outside, its interior expanded by some subtle magic that made distances hard to judge. Wooden benches ran in long rows, covered with pots of varying sizes. The glass roof, spotlessly clean, let in sheets of golden morning light that fell across ferns, strange flowering plants with petals that seemed to breathe. And in the center of the space, crates, wooden crates, roughly 24 of them, arranged on a long central bench. And from inside the crates came sounds. Not quite crying, not quite singing. Something in between, high-pitched and oddly musical despite its agitated quality. Thomas moved closer, drawn by curiosity stronger than nervousness. Through the slats of the nearest crate, he could see movement, writhing root-like appendages, and above them, a small, greenish face that looked remarkably baby-like, if babies were made of plant matter and screamed at the indignity of existence. Beautiful, aren't they? Professor Sprout had appeared beside him, her expression one of genuine fondness. They're about 4 months old now. Perfect age for repotting, old enough to have developed properly, young enough that their cry won't do permanent damage. Though I suggest, she added, raising her voice to address the entire class, that we all put our earmuffs on now, before we begin. Better safe than sorry, and these little ones are already quite vocal. Thomas pulled the earmuffs over his ears. The world immediately became muffled, distant, as if someone had wrapped him in cotton wool. Peter's mouth was moving, probably making some nervous comment, but Thomas couldn't hear him. He could only see the greenhouse bathed in golden light, the strange plants pressing against their crates, Professor Sprout gesturing toward the larger pots arranged on the benches, ready and waiting. And in that muffled silence, watching sunlight filter through glass onto plants that were both mundane and magical, Thomas felt something shift inside him. This was why he loved herbology. Not because it was easy, it wasn't, but because it was real. These were living things, growing and changing, requiring patience and care and attention. They were magic you could touch, magic that had roots and leaves and temperaments. Professor Sprout was saying something now, demonstrating with her hands. Thomas watched carefully, memorizing the movements. Lift the mandrake firmly but gently. Support the roots. Keep it away from your face. Plant it quickly in the new, larger pot. Pat the soil down around it. Simple actions, but requiring timing and confidence and respect for the small, screaming creature in your hands. The demonstration mandrake that Professor Sprout lifted from its crate looked deeply offended by the entire process. Its small green face contorted, its mouth opening wide, and even through the earmuffs, Thomas could hear a faint, high sound, like a whistle from very far away, or wind through a crack in old windows. Then it was in the new pot, and Professor Sprout was patting soil around it with the satisfied manner of someone who had done this 1,000 times and would happily do it 1,000 more. She turned to the class, smiled, and gestured toward the crates. It was time to begin. The greenhouse seemed to hold its breath in the moment before Professor Sprout gestured for them to begin. Thomas could feel it, a collective tension among the students, all of them standing in the filtered golden light, earmuffs making the world feel underwater and strange. Through the thick padding pressed against his ears, he could hear his own heartbeat, steady and insistent, and the faint, distant sound of the mandrake's cries like wind through a distant chimney. Professor Sprout moved between the benches with the easy confidence of someone entirely in her element. She pointed to different students, directing them to specific workstations, her mouth forming words that Thomas couldn't quite hear but could generally understand through context and gesture. Her hands moved in encouraging circles, her expression warm and patient. There was something almost choreographic about it. This silent distribution of students and plants, everyone finding their places in the greenhouse's humid warmth. Thomas found himself assigned to a workstation near the middle of the greenhouse, where light fell in thick golden bars across the wooden bench. Peter was stationed beside him, which provided some comfort. On Thomas's other side stood Sarah Chen, her textbook now abandoned on a side table, her expression intense with concentration. Across the bench, Marcus Webb shifted nervously from foot to foot, his dragon hide gloves looking comically oversized on his lanky frame. The bench itself had been prepared with careful attention. A large terracotta pot sat ready at each station, already partially filled with rich, dark soil that looked almost black in the shadowed light. Beside each pot stood a small trowel, a watering can filled with what Thomas assumed was dragon dung fertilizer, diluted to appropriate strength, and a small card with neat handwriting. Professor Sprout's instructions, he realized, for those who needed reminders or reassurance during the process. Thomas picked up the card, angling it to catch the light. 1. Grasp the mandrake firmly around the middle. Not the leaves, not the roots, 2. Lift steadily upward. Quick, confident movements, 3. Keep the root away from your face and body, 4. Transfer immediately to new pot, 5. Pack soil firmly but gently around the roots. 6. Water lightly. 7. Step back and allow the plant to settle. Simple enough in theory. Thomas had repotted dozens of plants over 3 years of herbology, bouncing bulbs, fanged geraniums, even a particularly aggressive specimen of devil's snare that had taken exception to being relocated. But those plants, difficult as they were, couldn't render you unconscious with sound. They couldn't make you wake up hours later in the hospital wing, missing lunch and possibly dinner, with Madame Pomfrey's disapproving expression hovering over you. Professor Sprout appeared beside his workstation, her round face creased with an encouraging smile. She pointed to his earmuffs, then to her own, making an exaggerated gesture of pressing them more firmly against her head. Thomas understood. Check the seal. Make sure they were properly positioned. He adjusted them carefully, feeling the enchanted padding compress more snugly against his skull. The world became even more muffled, his own breathing now the loudest sound he could hear. The professor gave him a thumbs up, then moved on to check Sarah's equipment. Thomas watched as she inspected each student's preparations with the same careful attention, adjusting Marcus's gloves, repositioning Diana Rosewood's pot, demonstrating again to Timothy Gordon exactly how to hold the trowel for proper soil packing. Nothing was left to chance. Professor Sprout might be fond of her plants, might speak to them as if they were beloved children, but she never forgot that beloved children could still be dangerous. A movement caught Thomas's eye. Professor Sprout was walking toward the central bench where the crates of mandrakes waited. She lifted one crate easily, despite its size, and Thomas caught a glimpse of powerful magic at work. The crate should have been heavy, full of soil and plant and water weight, but she carried it as if it were filled with feathers. A levitation charm, perhaps, or something more subtle. The magic of someone who had worked with plants for so many years that spells became instinct. She placed the crate on the bench in front of Thomas's workstation, then moved on to distribute others. One crate shared between every 2 students, he realized. He would share with Peter. Somehow, this made everything feel both more manageable and more real. They would do this together, even if they couldn't speak, couldn't offer verbal encouragement or warnings. Through the wooden slats of the crate, Thomas could see movement. The mandrakes inside were agitated, their cries growing more intense now that they'd been moved. Even through his earmuffs, the sound had increased from distant whistle to something more immediate, a high, thin keen that made his teeth ache slightly. He pressed the earmuffs more firmly against his head, grateful for their enchantments. Peter leaned over to look into the crate, his eyes wide behind his slightly fogged glasses. His mouth moved in what Thomas was fairly certain was a creative curse word. The mandrakes were clearly visible now. 3 of them in this particular crate, their small greenish bodies writhing among the soil, their faces contorted in what looked like absolute fury at being disturbed. They were, Thomas thought, remarkably ugly in a way that was almost endearing, like angry, mobile parsnips with grievances. Professor Sprout had returned to the front of the greenhouse. She held up one hand, commanding attention, and waited until every student was looking at her. Then, with deliberate slowness, she demonstrated the process again. Her hands moved through the steps with practiced precision. Grip, lift, transfer, pack, water, retreat. Simple, straightforward. Nothing to worry about. Except the mandrake in her hands was screaming. Thomas couldn't hear it properly through his earmuffs, but he could see it. The small mouth opened impossibly wide, the root-like body convulsing with the effort of its cry. And he could feel something too. A pressure in the air, like the atmospheric change before a thunderstorm. The mandrake's scream had a presence, had weight, even muffled and dampened by enchantment. Professor Sprout finished her demonstration, the mandrake now safely in its new pot, still screaming but beginning to settle. She turned back to the class, wiped soil from her hands onto her already dirty robes, and made a sweeping gesture that clearly meant, "Your turn." For a moment, nobody moved. 24 students stood frozen in the greenhouse's golden light, staring at their crates of angry plants, each of them probably thinking the same thing Thomas was thinking. I don't want to be the first one to fail. Then Diana Rosewood, bless her, reached into her crate with the calm confidence of someone who had never met a plant she couldn't handle. Her movements were quick and assured. Grip, lift, transfer. Her mandrake's mouth opened wide in protest, but Diana had it in its new pot before it could do more than begin its cry. She packed the soil with efficient movements, watered it with 2 precise tilts of her watering can, and stepped back. The whole process had taken perhaps 15 seconds. Professor Sprout was beside her immediately, examining the repotting with an expert eye. Then she smiled, clapped Diana on the shoulder, and held up her thumb in approval. Diana flushed with pleasure, pushing her dark hair behind her ears. The spell was broken. Around the greenhouse, students began reaching for their crates with varying degrees of confidence and terror. Thomas watched Marcus lift his mandrake with excessive caution, holding it at arm's length as if it might explode. He watched Sarah approach the task with methodical precision, consulting the instruction card between each step. He watched as a Ravenclaw boy he didn't know well fumbled his grip and nearly dropped his mandrake, catching it at the last moment with a lunge that made Professor Sprout move swiftly to his side, her hand out in case assistance was needed. Beside him, Peter was staring into their shared crate with the expression of someone contemplating a particularly difficult piece of homework, or possibly a death sentence. His dragon-hide gloves flexed as he opened and closed his hands nervously. Thomas made a decision. He would go first. Not because he was brave. He didn't feel particularly brave, but because waiting was worse. Waiting meant watching the mandrakes writhe and scream, meant imagining all the ways this could go wrong, meant letting nervousness curdle into genuine fear. He reached for the crate. The wood was rough under his gloved hands, warm from the greenhouse heat and the morning sun. Through the slats, he could see the 3 mandrakes more clearly now. They varied slightly in size, the largest perhaps 8 inches from root tip to leaf top, the smallest barely 6 inches. Their greenish skin had a waxy quality that caught the light. Their faces, crude and simple as they were, somehow managed to convey immense displeasure with their current circumstances. Thomas chose the middle-sized one. Not the largest, that seemed like asking for trouble, but not the smallest either, which might be more delicate, easier to damage. The middle one seemed, if such a thing could be said about an angry, magical plant, the most reasonable option. He opened the crate's lid carefully. Immediately, the sound level increased. Even through his earmuffs, he could hear the mandrake's cries more clearly now, that high keen that made something deep in his chest vibrate uncomfortably. The middle mandrake, sensing attention, screamed louder, its small face contorting with rage or fear, or simply the plant equivalent of extreme annoyance. Thomas took a breath. His hands, encased in dragon-hide gloves that smelled of sulfur and leather, felt clumsy and oversized. How was he supposed to grip something firmly yet gently while wearing what amounted to thick mittens? But Diana had done it. Professor Sprout had done it. He could do it. He reached into the crate. The mandrake's leaves were tougher than he'd expected, almost leathery against his gloves. Below them, the stem, was it a stem, a body, felt solid, packed with whatever magic made these plants so valuable and so dangerous. He wrapped his gloved hands around it, just below the leaves, just above where the roots began their tangled mass in the soil. The mandrake screamed louder. Its small mouth opened so wide, Thomas could see the pale interior, could see the vibration of its cry in the trembling of its leaves. Through his gloves, he could feel it writhing, trying to twist free of his grip. Firmly but gently, he reminded himself, like Professor Sprout showed us. Confident, quick. He pulled upward. For a horrible moment, nothing happened. The mandrake stayed rooted, literally, in its soil, and Thomas had a vision of himself pulling too hard, ripping the plant apart, facing Professor Sprout's disappointment and his own failure. But then the soil released its grip with a soft, sucking sound, and suddenly the mandrake was free, roots and all, dangling from his hands like a very angry, very loud infant. The roots were extraordinary. Thomas had seen illustrations in their textbook, had heard descriptions in lectures, but nothing had quite prepared him for the reality. They looked disturbingly like small, pale legs kicking in protest. They twisted and writhed in the air, dirt falling from them in clumps, and the mandrake's scream increased to a pitch that Thomas could feel in his bones despite the earmuff's protection. Transfer immediately to new pod. Right, don't stand here staring. Move. Thomas turned toward his prepared workstation, the mandrake held at arm's length, trying not to think about how much it looked like he was carrying an angry, screaming baby made of vegetable matter. The new pot waited, its opening dark and welcoming. He positioned the mandrake over it, lowered it as quickly as he dared, felt the roots make contact with the prepared soil. The mandrake's scream changed quality, still loud, still furious, but somehow less panicked, as if it understood, on some primitive plant level, that it was being put down rather than being devoured or destroyed. Thomas released his grip on the stem, his hands immediately reaching for the pile of additional soil beside the pot. Pack firmly but gently. The instruction card's words echoed in his mind. He scooped soil with a small trowel, poured it around the mandrake's roots, pressed it down with careful pressure. The mandrake continued screaming, its small face still contorted, but it had stopped writhing quite so violently. It was, Thomas realized, with something like wonder, beginning to settle. He added more soil, packing it in layers the way Professor Sprout had demonstrated. The mandrake's roots, no longer exposed to air, seemed to relax fractionally. Its leaves, which had been rigid with distress, began to soften and spread. By the time Thomas had filled the pot to the appropriate level, the scream had diminished to something more like a loud, ongoing complaint. The watering can felt heavy in his hands as he tilted it over the newly potted plant. Water, mixed with the distinctive smell of dragon dung fertilizer, darkened the soil and soaked down around the roots. The mandrake's scream dropped another notch. It was still making noise. It was, after all, a mandrake, and making noise was apparently their primary response to existence. But it was no longer the ear-splitting shriek of a few moments ago. Thomas stepped back, his heart pounding, his hands trembling slightly inside the dragon-hide gloves. He had done it. One mandrake, successfully repotted. The plant sat in its new pot, slightly crooked, still complaining, but visibly less distressed, its leaves beginning to orient themselves properly toward the greenhouse's glass ceiling and the sun beyond. A hand clapped him on the shoulder, making him jump. Professor Sprout stood beside him, her face creased with approval. Her mouth moved, and though Thomas couldn't hear the words through his earmuffs, he could read her expression clearly enough. Well done. The warmth of that approval spread through his chest, better than any comfort charm. He had been worried, had been nervous, had spent the last week imagining various disasters, but he had done it. He had handled a mandrake, one of the most dangerous plants in magical horticulture, and neither he nor the plant had come to any harm. Beside him, Peter was reaching into the crate for his own attempt. Thomas watched as his friend's gloved hands closed around one of the remaining mandrakes, the largest one, naturally, because Peter had the worst luck of anyone Thomas knew. The plant emerged from its crate, screaming like all the fury of small, angry nature compressed into one root vegetable, with pretensions of personality. But Peter, for all his nervous energy and tendency toward minor disasters, had been paying attention. His movements were quick and confident. The mandrake barely had time to register its freedom before it was being lowered into a new pot. And within moments, Peter was packing soil with the focused intensity of someone determined not to be outdone by his roommate. Around the greenhouse, similar scenes were playing out. Students approached their crates with fear or confidence or careful neutrality, lifted their mandrakes with varying degrees of success, transferred them to new pots with movements that ranged from expert to merely adequate. The air filled with the muffled sounds of screaming plants, the thick smell of soil and fertilizer, and the golden October light that made everything feel slightly dreamlike. Professor Sprout moved between the workstations like a conductor managing an orchestra, adjusting a grip here, steadying a pot there, offering encouragement with smiles and shoulder pats and occasional demonstrations of proper technique. Once, when Timothy Gordon fumbled his mandrake and nearly dropped it, she caught it with a wandless summoning charm, so subtle Thomas almost missed it, the plant floating gently back into Timothy's hands as if by its own volition. Sarah Chen, predictably, completed her repotting with textbook perfection, then immediately reached for the second mandrake in her crate, apparently eager to practice the technique again. Marcus Webb took twice as long as anyone else, but approached each step with such careful attention that his mandrake seemed almost confused by the gentleness of its treatment, its screams diminishing to something like bewildered muttering. Thomas looked at his own successfully potted plant, then at the crate that still held one more mandrake, the last one, the smallest of their three. It looked up at him, or at least its small face oriented in his direction, with an expression that might have been fear or rage, or simply the generic distress of a young plant that didn't understand why its world kept changing. One more, Thomas thought. I can do one more. He reached for the crate again, and this time his hands didn't tremble quite so much. This time, when the small mandrake screamed in his grip, he recognized the sound not as something terrifying, but as communication, a plant expressing discomfort in the only way it knew how. This time, when he lowered it into its new pot and packed the soil around its roots, he did so with something approaching confidence. The greenhouse continued its work around him, filled with golden light and the smell of earth, with Professor Sprout's patient guidance and the students' careful concentration. And Thomas, standing at his workstation with two successfully repotted mandrakes before him, felt something shift in his understanding of magic. This was real. This was immediate. This was the kind of magic that got under your fingernails and made your back ache and required patience and attention and genuine care. It wasn't flashy. It wouldn't win any jewels or impress anyone at parties. But it was alive, growing, changing, magic with roots and stems and voices, however loud and inconvenient those voices might be. And somehow, standing there in the warm greenhouse with soil on his gloves and his earmuffs pressing against his skull, Thomas had never felt more like a proper wizard. The greenhouse had settled into a rhythm now, the initial panic giving way to focused concentration. Thomas watched as Peter finished with his second mandrake, patting the soil down with the careful attention of someone who had decided that if he was going to do this, he was going to do it properly. The plant in question seemed marginally less offended than its predecessor, its screams diminishing to what might generously be called vigorous complaining. Around them, The other students worked at varying paces. Some, like Diana and Sarah, had already completed all their assigned repottings and were helping Professor Sprout check on others. Some, like Timothy Gordon, were still wrestling with their first mandrake, their movements tentative and overcautious in a way that seemed to make the plants more agitated rather than less. Thomas wiped his gloved hands on his workrobes. They were already covered in soil anyway. What was a bit more? And surveyed his 2 completed pots. The mandrakes sat in their new homes, leaves spreading toward the light, roots hopefully settling into the fresh soil. They were still making noise, of course. That seemed to be their natural state. But the quality of the sound had changed from panic to mere dissatisfaction, which Thomas counted as progress. Professor Sprout appeared at his elbow, making him jump slightly. She had a remarkable ability to move silently, despite her solid build and perpetually dirt-covered boots. She examined his work with the critical eye of someone who knew plants the way most people knew their own families, tilting her head to inspect the soil level, the plant positioning, the general state of each mandrake. Then she smiled, that warm, approving smile that made students feel like they'd accomplished something genuinely worthwhile, and patted his shoulder twice. Her mouth formed words that Thomas couldn't quite hear, but understood instinctively. Excellent work. She moved on to inspect Peter's pots, leaving Thomas with a pleasant glow of accomplishment that he tried not to show too obviously on his face. There was something deeply satisfying about meeting Professor Sprout's exacting standards. She wasn't harsh. She never raised her voice or made students feel small. But she expected competence, care, and attention to the living things in their charge. Earning her approval meant something. A commotion near the back of the greenhouse drew his attention. Thomas turned to see Marcus Webb, gesticulating frantically, his tall frame bent awkwardly over his workstation. Professor Sprout was already moving in that direction, her pace quick but not panicked. Thomas followed her with his eyes, curious despite knowing he should probably focus on his own work. Marcus had apparently discovered a problem with his 3rd mandrake. The plant was halfway out of its crate, suspended in Marcus's gloved hands, but something was clearly wrong. Its leaves had gone limp, drooping against Marcus's fingers, and its screaming had taken on a different quality. Weaker, more distressed. Even from across the greenhouse, Thomas could see that the roots looked damaged, several of them torn or twisted in a way that suggested rough handling, or perhaps a weakness that had existed before Marcus even touched it. Professor Sprout took the mandrake from Marcus with gentle firmness, her expression concerned but not alarmed. She examined the damaged roots carefully, her fingers probing the injury with the delicate touch of a healer assessing a wound. Then she did something Thomas had never seen before. She drew her wand and performed a charm he didn't recognize, a series of intricate wand movements accompanied by words too quiet to hear, even without the earmuffs. Soft golden light enveloped the mandrake. The damaged roots seemed to shimmer, and slowly, so slowly, Thomas wasn't entirely sure he wasn't imagining it. They began to knit themselves back together. Not perfectly, not like they'd never been injured, but enough that the plant's leaves perked up slightly, its weak crying strengthening back to something more like normal mandrake indignation. Professor Sprout lowered the plant into Marcus's prepared pot herself, demonstrating again the proper packing technique, while Marcus watched with an expression of profound relief mixed with embarrassment. She patted his shoulder reassuringly, said something that made him nod vigorously, and then moved on to check the next student. Thomas filed the incident away in his mind as something to ask about later, when they could all hear properly again. What was that healing charm? Could it be used on any magical plant or just mandrakes? Did it require special training, or could any competent witch or wizard learn it? These were the kinds of questions that Hermione Granger, the famous third of the Golden Trio, would probably have already researched extensively, complete with citations from 3 different texts and a practical demonstration. A movement in the corner of his vision made Thomas turn. Sarah Chen had abandoned her own completed work and was now standing very still, staring at something on the bench beside her station. Thomas followed her gaze and felt his breath catch. The crate she'd been working from, now empty of mandrakes, had been pushed slightly to one side, and in the space it had previously occupied, partially hidden by a sprawling fanged geranium in a neighboring pot, sat a single mandrake that Thomas hadn't noticed before. It was smaller than any of the others he'd seen today, no more than 4 inches tall, its greenish body almost translucent in the golden light. But that wasn't what made it remarkable. Unlike every other mandrake in the greenhouse, all of which were screaming with varying degrees of intensity, this one was silent. Its small mouth was closed, its crude face somehow peaceful, and as Thomas watched, barely breathing, afraid any movement might disturb it, the tiny mandrake's leaves began to move in a pattern that had nothing to do with distress or agitation. They were swaying, gently, rhythmically, as if dancing to music no one else could hear. Sarah saw it too. She turned to catch Thomas's eye, her expression a mixture of wonder and confusion. She pointed to the mandrake, then to her earmuffs, raising her eyebrows in a clear question. Should we be concerned? Thomas shook his head slowly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. He wasn't concerned. He was fascinated. The tiny mandrake continued its silent movement, and now that Thomas was paying attention, he noticed something else. The other mandrakes, the ones that were screaming and complaining in their newly assigned pots, their leaves were moving too. Not randomly, not with the chaotic thrashing of distressed plants, but with a kind of synchronization, as if they were all responding to the same invisible conductor. He stepped closer to his own workstation, studying his 2 repotted mandrakes more carefully. Yes, there it was. The leaves moved in waves, rising and falling with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, and the screaming, which had been constant background noise for the past 20 minutes, seemed to be organizing itself into something more structured. Thomas pressed his earmuffs more firmly against his head, trying to hear better, despite knowing that was exactly what the earmuffs were designed to prevent. The sound was still muffled, still distant, but he could make out patterns now, high notes and low notes, quick bursts and sustained cries, all weaving together in a way that was almost musical. Peter grabbed his arm, making him jump. His friend's eyes were wide behind his smudged glasses, and he was pointing emphatically at the mandrakes on their shared bench. He'd noticed it too. The patterns, the synchronization, the way the plant's individual complaints were forming something larger, something that transcended any single voice. Around the greenhouse, other students were beginning to notice as well. Diana stood frozen at her station, her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something just at the edge of a hearing. Timothy had stopped mid-motion, his hands still hovering over a pot, his expression puzzled but captivated. Marcus, recovered from his earlier mishap, was staring at his mandrakes with the look of someone who had just discovered that mathematics could dance. Professor Sprout moved through the greenhouse with quick, purposeful strides, but Thomas noticed that she wasn't trying to stop whatever was happening. Instead, she was adjusting the positions of certain pots, moving them slightly closer together or farther apart, as if fine-tuning an instrument. Her face held an expression Thomas had never seen before. Not quite surprise, but something close to it. Excitement, perhaps, or recognition of something rare and unexpected. The small, silent mandrake that Sarah had discovered was moving more vigorously now, its leaves conducting an invisible orchestra, its translucent body catching the light and scattering it in pale green patterns across the bench. And as Thomas watched, the other mandrake's movements began to align more perfectly with its gestures. The silent one was leading them, he realized. It was somehow coordinating all the other plants' voices into something coherent. The sound penetrating his earmuffs was growing stronger, more distinct. Thomas could hear layers now, high crystalline notes that reminded him of wind chimes, deeper bass tones like distant thunder, and everything in between weaving together in complex harmonies. It shouldn't have been possible. These were baby mandrakes, magical plants with minimal intelligence, nothing more than glorified vegetables with unusual properties. They shouldn't be capable of creating music. And yet, Thomas found himself swaying slightly, unconsciously matching his movement to the rhythm of the plants. Beside him, Peter was doing the same, his earlier nervousness completely forgotten. Sarah had her eyes closed, her expression blissful, as if listening to her favorite symphony. Around the greenhouse, students stood transfixed, their work abandoned, their attention entirely captured by the impossible concert happening in their midst. The sunlight streaming through the glass seemed to brighten, or perhaps Thomas's perception was shifting, making everything more vivid. He could see dust motes dancing in the light, moving in time with the mandrake's song. He could see the fanged geranium's petals opening and closing rhythmically. He could see other plants throughout the greenhouse responding to the sound. Ferns unfurling fronds, vines swaying on their supports. Even the gnarled devil snare in the corner seemed to be moving less aggressively, more gracefully. Professor Sprout had stopped her adjustments and was simply standing in the center of the greenhouse, her expression one of pure wonder. Her hands were clasped in front of her chest, and her eyes moved from plant to plant, taking in every detail of the phenomenon unfolding around her. Thomas had the distinct impression that this was something she had perhaps heard of, but never witnessed. A rare occurrence, a gift of circumstance and timing, and the right combination of factors. The music, and Thomas could no longer think of it as mere screaming, built to a crescendo. The tiny conducting mandrake's movements became more expansive, its entire body swaying with the effort of coordination. The other plants responded, their voices rising and falling in perfect harmony, creating waves of sound that seemed to resonate in Thomas's chest, even through the protective enchantments of his earmuffs. It was beautiful, genuinely, unexpectedly beautiful. Thomas felt something tight in his chest begin to loosen, tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. accumulated from weeks of classes and homework and the general stress of being 13 years old in a magical castle where staircases moved and portraits gossiped, and you were constantly one mistake away from turning your friend into a teacup. The Mandrake's song washed over him, through him, and he felt himself relaxing in a way he usually only managed late at night in the Hufflepuff common room. Warm fire crackling, comfortable chair. Nothing required of him except rest. But this was different. This was active peace, engaged tranquility. He was fully present, fully aware, and fully at ease all at once. The song reached its peak. All the mandrakes crying out together in a chord that seemed to contain every emotion Thomas had ever felt. Joy and sorrow, fear and courage, loneliness and belonging, all wrapped together and transformed into something pure and clear and true. And then, slowly, gently, it began to wind down. The tiny conductor's movements became smaller, less urgent. The other mandrakes' voices softened, their harmonies simplifying, resolving into something more peaceful. One by one, the plants settled into silence. Not the distressed, agitated quiet of a scream held back, but genuine, contented silence. Their leaves spread naturally toward the light, their roots invisible beneath the soil, presumably settled into their new homes. They had sung their distress and their acceptance and their strange vegetable joy, and now they were simply done. Thomas became aware that he was crying, not sobbing, not dramatic tears, just moisture on his cheeks that had appeared without him noticing. He wiped at his face with the back of his gloved hand, embarrassed, then noticed that he wasn't alone. Sarah's eyes were wet. Peter was blinking rapidly, his glasses slightly fogged. Diana was openly crying, not bothering to hide it. Even Marcus, tall and awkward Marcus, who usually affected an air of casual indifference to most things, had tears tracking down his face. Professor Sprout pulled off her earmuffs, the first person to do so. She stood in the now quiet greenhouse, surrounded by silent plants and crying students, and her own eyes were bright with moisture. She looked around at all of them, her gaze taking in each face, each expression of wonder and confusion and emotional overwhelm. Then she smiled, that warm, knowing smile that said, "You've just experienced something special, something most people never witness. Remember this." She gestured for them to remove their earmuffs. Thomas pulled his off, slowly, half expecting the mandrakes to immediately start screaming again, to break the spell of the moment. But silence greeted him. Real silence. Profound and complete. The greenhouse held its breath. The plants sat peaceful in their pots. Even the small conducting mandrake was still now, its translucent body catching the light, but no longer moving. "Well," Professor Sprout said, her voice slightly rough with emotion, "that was unexpected." Understatement of the century, Thomas thought. "What?" Timothy Gordon started, then stopped, apparently unsure how to formulate his question. Professor Sprout walked to the bench where the small mandrake sat, the one that had conducted the others. She looked down at it with an expression of profound respect. "That," she said softly, "was a chorus. A mandrake chorus. I've read about them in ancient texts, heard stories from my grandmother who worked with plants her entire life, but I've never..." She paused, collecting herself. "In all my years teaching, all my years growing things, I have never witnessed one myself." "Why did they do that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly, might somehow damage the memory of what they'd just heard. Professor Sprout considered the question carefully. Mandrakes are more sensitive than most people realize. They respond to stress, to change, to each other. When you repot them, when you handle them with care and attention, when you're gentle despite their screaming, when you work together in the same space with the same purpose, sometimes, if the conditions are exactly right, they respond, they communicate, they create something beautiful from their distress. She turned to face the class, her expression serious but warm. What you just experienced is rare, precious. It happens perhaps once in a generation, and only when the plants feel safe enough, respected enough, to express themselves fully. You gave them that, all of you, through your careful work, your attention, your genuine care for living things. Thomas felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with completing his assignment and everything to do with being part of something larger. They had done this, not intentionally, not through any special skill or knowledge, but simply by treating these difficult, dangerous plants with the respect they deserved. Will they do it again? Marcus asked, his voice hopeful. Professor Sprout smiled sadly. Unlikely. Mandrake choruses are born of specific moments. The right age of plants, the right environmental conditions, the right emotional atmosphere. You can't force them. You can't plan for them. They simply happen, or they don't. She moved among the students, examining their completed work with fresh eyes. But I want you all to remember this. Remember that magic isn't just spells and potions and wand movements. It's this. It's living things responding to care. It's unexpected beauty emerging from difficult work. It's the moment when everything aligns and something impossible becomes real. Thomas looked at his two mandrakes, sitting peacefully in their pots, and felt a surge of affection for the small, ugly plants that had just given him one of the most profound experiences of his young life. They were quiet now, content, but he would never forget the sound of their singing, the way their voices had woven together into something transcendent. Around him, other students were having similar moments of connection with their plants. Peter was gently adjusting the soil around one of his mandrakes, his touch careful and reverent. Sarah was sketching in the margin of her instruction card, apparently trying to capture some visual memory of what had just happened. Diana was simply standing still, her hand resting lightly on her workbench, her expression peaceful. The greenhouse felt different now. The golden light hadn't changed. The smell of earth and fertilizer remained the same, but something fundamental had shifted. They had entered as students, completing an assignment, nervous about handling dangerous plants. They were leaving as something else, witnesses to magic in its purest form, participants in a moment of genuine wonder. Professor Sprout began directing them to clean their stations, her voice gentle but practical. Work still needed to be done after all. The mandrakes would need continued care. The greenhouse would need tidying. Life would return to its normal rhythms. But as Thomas carefully removed his dragon hide gloves and began wiping soil from his bench, he knew that nothing would ever be quite the same. He had heard the mandrakes sing. He had been part of their chorus. And somewhere deep in his chest, in a place he couldn't quite name, their music was still playing. The cleanup process felt almost meditative after the intensity of the mandrake chorus. Thomas moved through the familiar motions, wiping soil from his workbench, rinsing his gloves in the basin Professor Sprout had conjured near the greenhouse entrance, arranging his tools in their proper places. But his mind was elsewhere, still caught in the echo of what he'd witnessed. Around him, the other students worked in similar distracted silence. Not the tense, nervous quiet that had preceded the lesson, but something softer, more contemplative. Occasionally, someone would glance at the now peaceful mandrakes and smile, as if confirming that what they'd experienced had actually happened and wasn't some collective hallucination brought on by greenhouse humidity and dragon dung fumes. Professor Sprout moved among them, offering quiet instructions and guidance. But Thomas noticed that she too kept looking at the plants with an expression that mixed professional satisfaction with genuine wonder. Her hands, as she helped students properly store the dragon hide gloves and fold the earmuffs, moved with an extra gentleness, as if she were handling sacred objects rather than ordinary equipment. Peter finished cleaning his station and drifted over to where Thomas was carefully arranging his newly potted mandrakes at the edge of the bench, where they would receive optimal light for the next stage of their growth. His friend's hair was sticking up at even more improbable angles than usual, and there was a smudge of soil across his cheek that he seemed entirely unaware of. That was... Peter started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words adequate to the experience. Yeah, Thomas agreed. Sometimes a single word was enough. They stood together in companionable silence, watching their mandrakes. The plants had truly settled now, their leaves spread in natural positions. Their crude faces, if you could call them that, relaxed into something that might almost be contentment. It was hard to believe these were the same screaming, writhing creatures they'd wrestled with less than an hour ago. Sarah Chen approached, her textbook tucked under her arm, her expression thoughtful in that intense way she had when something had captured her intellectual curiosity. "I've been thinking," she said, which was such a quintessentially Sarah statement that both Thomas and Peter smiled, about what Professor Sprout said, about the conditions having to be exactly right. And Thomas prompted when she paused, well, what if it wasn't just the conditions in the greenhouse? What if it was us? She gestured broadly to encompass all the students. Think about it. We were all nervous, right? All feeling the same emotions, fear, excitement, determination. And we were all working together at the same time, toward the same goal. What if the mandrakes were responding to that collective emotional state? Peter considered this. You mean they were feeding off our feelings? That's a bit creepy when you say it like that. Not feeding off them, Sarah clarified, her tone taking on the lecturing quality that meant she was warming to her subject, resonating with them, like strings on different instruments all being tuned to the same pitch. When one vibrates, the others respond. Thomas thought about this, remembering the moment when the chorus had begun. Sarah might be onto something. The mandrakes had started organizing their cries after most students had successfully completed at least one repotting, after the initial panic had given way to focus and confidence, after they'd all proven to themselves and to the plants that they could handle the task with care and attention. So you're saying the mandrakes knew we weren't going to hurt them? He asked. Maybe not knew exactly. They're not that intelligent, from what I've read, but sensed, felt. However, plants perceive these things. Sarah pulled out her textbook and began flipping through pages. There's a chapter in here about magical plant sentience. I should review it. This could be related to the theories about Sarah. Peter interrupted gently. Maybe just let it be mysterious for a bit. Not everything needs to be researched and explained immediately. Sarah looked up from her book, surprised, then slowly closed it. You're right. Sorry. When something amazing happens, my first instinct is to understand it. Understanding is good, Thomas said. But remembering is good too. Sometimes you can't do both at once. They stood together, 3 students from different houses, Thomas and Peter from Hufflepuff, Sarah from Ravenclaw, united by shared experience and the lingering sense of having witnessed something beyond ordinary magic. Around them, the greenhouse continued its quiet afternoon life. Dust motes danced in the golden light. Somewhere, water dripped with rhythmic patience. The smell of earth and growing things filled the air with a richness that felt almost alive. Marcus Webb and Diana Rosewood were having a quiet conversation near their workstations. Marcus's usual awkward gestures absent as he made a point about something, Diana nodding thoughtfully. Timothy Gordon was carefully sketching something in his notebook, probably the small conducting mandrake, Thomas guessed. Other students worked or talked in small groups, their voices hushed, as if the greenhouse had become a place that demanded reverence. Professor Sprout's voice, when it came, was gentle but carried clearly through the space. If I could have your attention, please, dear ones. The quiet conversations ceased. Everyone turned to face her. She stood near the central bench, her round face serious but warm, her patched hat somehow having regained its usual precarious angle. I want to speak with you about what happened today before you leave. It's important that you understand what you experienced, and equally important that you understand what it means going forward. The students moved closer, forming a loose semicircle around her. Thomas noticed that no one stood far apart. They all seemed drawn together, as if the shared experience had created invisible threads connecting them. What you witnessed today, Professor Sprout began, was a form of magic that predates wands, predates formal spell work, predates even the founding of Hogwarts. It's the magic of living things responding to the world around them with their whole being. The Mandrake Chorus is mentioned in texts dating back to ancient Greece, referenced in medieval herbology manuscripts, and described in the personal journals of some of history's greatest plant specialists. But it's never been common, and it's never been predictable. She paused, looking at each of them in turn. My grandmother, who taught me most of what I know about working with magical plants, experienced a mandrake chorus exactly once in her 70-year career. She said it changed how she understood her work, changed what she believed plants were capable of feeling and expressing. I believe the same may be true for you. Thomas felt the truth of this settling into his bones. He had come to herbology class this morning, thinking of mandrakes as dangerous magical plants, useful for their properties, but essentially just sophisticated vegetables with unusual characteristics. Now, he understood them as something more, beings with their own form of consciousness, capable of communication and even collaboration when the circumstances aligned. However, Professor Sprout's tone became more serious. I need you all to understand that what happened today doesn't mean mandrakes are suddenly safe or predictable. They're still dangerous. The mature plant's cries can still kill. Even these juveniles could render you unconscious if you handled them carelessly. The chorus was a gift, a moment of grace, but it doesn't change the fundamental nature of these plants. Marcus raised his hand tentatively. Professor, the small one that seemed to be conducting the others. What is it? Why was it different? Professor Sprout's expression softened with what looked like affection. Ah, yes, our little conductor. She moved to the bench where the translucent mandrake still sat, peaceful and quiet. This is what we call a ghost mandrake. Quite rare. They occur perhaps once in every 1,000 normal mandrakes, a genetic variation that makes them physically weaker but more sensitive to magical energies and the presence of other plants. They rarely survive to maturity in the wild because they're so fragile, but in cultivation, with proper care, they can become. She paused, searching for the right word. Intermediaries, bridges between normal mandrakes and the world around them. So it was translating for the others, Sarah asked, her scholarly instincts clearly overcoming her earlier decision to let things remain mysterious. In a sense, Professor Sprout agreed. Ghost mandrakes can sense and respond to emotional energies that normal mandrakes only dimly perceive. When you all work together with such care and focus, this little one felt it, understood it, and helped the others feel it too. The result was the chorus. Thomas stared at the small plant with new respect. It looked so delicate, so vulnerable, but it had somehow orchestrated something miraculous. Will you keep it separate from the others now? He asked, since it's so rare and important. Professor Sprout shook her head. No, I'll keep it with its cohort. Ghost mandrakes do better when they're among their own kind, even if they're different from those around them. Isolation would weaken it more than any physical fragility. It needs community, even if its relationship to that community is unique. There was something profound in that statement, something that Thomas felt applied to more than just magical plants. He thought about Hufflepuff House, about how students of all different backgrounds and abilities were brought together, expected to work as a unit despite their differences. He thought about the way he'd felt during the chorus, individual but also part of something larger, his own experience both unique and shared. Professor Sprout seemed to sense the contemplative mood that had settled over the class. Now then, she said, her tone becoming more practical. Let's discuss ongoing care for your mandrakes. They'll need to remain in Greenhouse 3 for the next several weeks, where I can monitor them closely. You'll each be assigned time to check on your plants, water them, and observe their development. This isn't extra work. It's part of your regular herbology study. But it will require you to come to the greenhouse outside of normal class hours. She began organizing students into pairs and assigning them specific days and times. Thomas found himself partnered with Diana Rosewood, a pairing that made sense, given that Diana had more practical experience with difficult plants than almost anyone in their year. She caught his eye and smiled, seeming pleased with the arrangement. You'll come Monday and Thursday afternoons, Professor Sprout told them, checking a list she'd conjured with a flick of her wand. Just after your last class. 20 minutes should be sufficient. Check soil moisture. Inspect for any signs of distress or disease, and make notes in the observation log I'll provide. Simple maintenance, but crucial for their development. Other partnerships were announced. Peter with Marcus, Sarah with Timothy. various other combinations that seemed designed to pair students with complementary skills and temperaments. Professor Sprout, Thomas realized, put considerable thought into these arrangements. She wasn't just assigning random partners, she was creating opportunities for students to learn from each other, to build connections across house lines and social groups. One final thing, Professor Sprout said, when all the assignments had been made. I would ask that you not speak too freely about the chorus outside of those who witnessed it. Not because it's secret, exactly, but because she paused, considering her words. Because it was a gift, a rare and precious moment, and gifts like that can become diminished when they're shared too widely, explained too thoroughly, turned into just another story to tell over dinner. Hold it close for a while. Let it settle into your understanding. Later, when enough time has passed, you can share it with others if you wish. But for now, let it be yours. Thomas understood what she meant. Already, he could imagine trying to describe the chorus to his roommates back in the Hufflepuff common room, could imagine the inadequacy of words to capture what he'd felt. Better to keep it quiet, to protect it, until he'd had time to fully process what it meant to him. The class began to disperse, students collecting their belongings and preparing to leave for their next lessons or free periods. Thomas gathered his bag, his textbook, his notes from the morning. Everything felt both ordinary and transformed. These same objects that had accompanied him to Herbology class now carried the weight of shared experience. Diana caught up with him near the greenhouse door. Monday afternoon then, she said. I'm looking forward to working together. Your repotting technique was quite good, efficient without being rushed. Thomas felt himself flush slightly at the compliment. Thanks. You made it look easy. Years of practice, Diana admitted. My mum's a professional herbologist, works for the ministry in the Department of Magical Plant Regulation. I've been around difficult plants since I could walk, but knowing technique and experiencing something like the chorus are very different things. Her expression grew more serious. That was extraordinary. Thomas. I've read about mandrake choruses in my mum's old journals, but she'd never heard one herself. We witnessed something truly rare today. They walked together through the greenhouse door and out into the October afternoon. The temperature outside felt shockingly cool after the humid warmth inside, and Thomas pulled his robes closer. The ground stretched before them, the castle rising in its familiar magnificence, the lake glinting in the distance, the forbidden forest, a dark smudge on the horizon. Peter and Sarah were waiting outside, apparently having struck up a conversation about the theoretical magical mechanics of plant communication. Marcus had joined them, his tall frame bent slightly as he listened to Sarah's explanation of something involving emotional resonance and thaumaturgical fields. Ready for transfiguration? Peter asked when he spotted Thomas and Diana. McGonagall's going to wonder why we're all so distracted. Should we tell her? Marcus wondered. About the chorus? Diana shook her head. Professor Sprout asked us to keep it quiet for now. We should respect that. They began walking toward the castle, a small group of students from different houses, bound together by shared experience. Thomas found himself in the middle of the group, listening to his friends discuss what they'd witnessed, offering his own observations when prompted. The conversation flowed naturally, easily, without the usual house-based divisions that sometimes made mixed groups feel awkward or forced. As they climbed the stone steps to the castle entrance, Thomas glanced back at the greenhouses. From this distance, they looked peaceful and ordinary, just 3 glass structures catching the afternoon light. But he knew what they contained now. Not just plants and soil and carefully controlled growing conditions, but the potential for magic that transcended ordinary understanding. The castle swallowed them, its familiar corridors and moving staircases, its portraits chattering among themselves, its perpetual smell of stone and candle wax, and hundreds of years of magical education. Students flowed through the halls between classes, creating the usual controlled chaos of a Thursday afternoon. Everything was normal, ordinary, exactly as it had been that morning. But Thomas felt different, changed somehow in ways he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. He had gone to herbology class, expecting to learn a practical skill, to successfully repot dangerous plants without rendering himself unconscious. He had accomplished that, certainly. But he had also learned something deeper about care and attention, about community and individual contribution, about the unexpected beauty that could emerge when living things were treated with genuine respect. His mandrakes were settling into their new pots in Greenhouse 3, their roots spreading through fresh soil, their leaves reaching toward light. And somewhere inside Thomas, something similar was happening. Roots of understanding spreading, reaching toward a new comprehension of what magic could be when it emerged not from wands and incantations, but from the simple act of nurturing life. Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration classroom came into view, and Thomas felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that preceded her classes. She would expect focus, precision, perfect attention to detail. There would be no room for distraction, no tolerance for wandering thoughts about singing plants and emotional resonance. But as Thomas took his seat and pulled out his wand, he found that he wasn't as worried as usual. The morning had taught him something about focus, about being fully present with difficult work, about trusting in his own capability, even when faced with something challenging and potentially dangerous. The mandrakes had screamed their distress and their acceptance and their strange joy, and Thomas, sitting in a Transfiguration classroom with his friends around him and his wand in his hand, felt an echo of that acceptance settling into his own heart. He could do difficult things. He could handle challenging magic. He could be part of something larger than himself while still maintaining his own unique contribution. Professor McGonagall swept into the room, her robes creating sharp lines against the stone walls, her expression set in its usual severe efficiency. But when her eyes swept over the students from her herbology class, Thomas and Peter and Sarah and the others, Thomas could have sworn he saw the briefest flicker of curiosity in her stern face, as if she could sense that something had changed, that these particular students were carrying something new with them. "Wands out," she commanded, her voice crisp and authoritative. "Today we'll be working on inanimate to animate transfiguration, specifically transforming wooden blocks into small mammals. This is NEWT level work, but I believe you're ready to begin learning the fundamentals. Difficult work, then. Challenging magic. The kind of lesson that would normally make Thomas's hands sweat and his confidence falter. But as he positioned his wooden block on the desk before him and raised his wand, Thomas felt steady, centered, ready. The mandrakes had taught him something about facing difficult challenges with care and attention, about trusting in his own capability, about being part of a larger whole while still contributing his unique effort. He took a breath, focused his intention, and began the complex wand movement Professor McGonagall had demonstrated. And though the transformation was far from perfect, his wooden block became something that looked more like a confused hamster than the proper mouse she'd requested. Thomas felt satisfied with the attempt. He had tried. He had focused. He had brought the same care and attention to this magic that he'd brought to the mandrakes that morning. And somewhere in Greenhouse 3, his plants were settling into their new homes, their roots spreading, their growth continuing, just as something inside Thomas was growing, changing, developing into whatever it would become. Magic, he was learning, wasn't just about spells and potions and textbook knowledge. It was about nurturing, patience, attention. It was about being present with difficult work and trusting that care would produce its own kind of beauty. The afternoon continued around him. Wand movements and incantations, Professor McGonagall's corrections and rare praise, the familiar rhythm of magical education. But Thomas carried the morning's experience with him, like a seed planted deep, already beginning to grow. The weekend arrived with a kind of slow, gentle progression that made Hogwarts feel less like a school and more like a home that happened to require homework. Saturday morning found Thomas in the Hufflepuff common room, ostensibly working on his transfiguration essay about the theoretical limitations of inanimate to animate transformation, but actually spending more time staring at the fire than at his parchment. The common room was particularly cozy on autumn mornings, low-ceilinged and earth-toned, with its round windows looking out onto the grounds at ankle level. It had always felt to Thomas like a comfortable burrow, safe and warm and quietly welcoming. The house elves had been by earlier, banking the fires and leaving fresh tea on the side tables, their invisible service creating an atmosphere of cared-for comfort that permeated everything Hufflepuff. Peter sat across from him, supposedly reading their potions textbook, but clearly dozing, his head nodding forward every few minutes before jerking back up. A few other students scattered throughout the room, worked on their own assignments, or played quiet games of gobstons in the corner. The weekend morning stretched peacefully ahead, hours of unstructured time before lunch. But Thomas couldn't focus. His mind kept returning to Thursday's herbology lesson, to the moment when the mandrakes had found their rhythm and transformed individual screams into collective song. He tried to write about it in his journal last night, something he did occasionally when experiences felt too large to process internally. But the words had come out flat and inadequate, capturing the facts but missing the feeling entirely. A tap on his shoulder made him jump. Sarah Chen stood beside his chair, her own bag slung over her shoulder, her expression bright with purpose. "I'm going to the library," she announced. "Want to come?" I found a reference in Advanced Magical Botany about plant consciousness that I want to follow up on, and I thought you might be interested. Thomas glanced at his barely started essay, then at the fire, then back at Sarah. Research wasn't usually his preferred weekend activity. He was more of a go-flying or wander the grounds type when given free time. But something in Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious. And the truth was, he did want to understand more about what they'd experienced. "Sure," he said, gathering his things. "Let me just—" Peter's head jerked up, suddenly awake. "Library? Are we going to the library? You were asleep 30 seconds ago," Thomas pointed out. "I'm awake now, and I'm coming with you. Can't let you two have all the fun researching obscure plant magic without me." Peter stood, stretching, his robes rumpled from slouching. "Besides, I should probably at least look at my transfiguration essay before Monday." The three of them made their way through the castle, which had settled into its weekend rhythm. Fewer students rushing between classes, more relaxed conversations in corridors, the occasional ghost drifting past with their eternal preoccupations. Nearly headless Nick passed them near the main staircase, deep in conversation with the fat friar about something that seemed to involve animated disagreement about 16th century ecclesiastical policy. The library was busier than Thomas expected for a Saturday morning, but most students seemed focused on their own work, bent over books or parchment at the long tables. Madame Pince patrolled between the shelves with her usual hawk-like vigilance, ready to swoop down on anyone who dared mistreat a book or speak above a whisper. Sarah led them directly to the Herbology section, her movements confident and purposeful. She'd clearly been here before, probably multiple times since Thursday. Within minutes, she'd pulled several volumes from the shelves and was spreading them across an empty table in the corner, away from the main study area. "Here," she said, opening the largest tome to a marked page. "This is what I found last night. Principles of Botanical Sentience by Gethsemane Prickle, published in 1847. There's an entire chapter on collective plant behaviors." Thomas and Peter leaned in to read. The text was dense, written in the formal academic style of a century ago, but certain passages caught his attention. The phenomenon of synchronized response among magical flora has been documented in various species, most notably in the whomping willow's coordinated defensive movements and the venomous tentaculars' hunting patterns. However, the most remarkable instance remains the mandrake chorus, in which juvenile plants of the species Mandragora officinarum produce harmonized vocalizations under specific environmental and emotional conditions. "Emotional conditions," Peter read aloud. So Sarah was right. It is about feelings. Sarah flipped several pages ahead. "Look at this part. The mandrake chorus appears to require not merely the presence of multiple plants, but a specific atmospheric quality that this researcher can only describe as concentrated, positive intention. In the 3 documented cases this author has personally investigated, the chorus occurred during periods when the plants were being handled by individuals who demonstrated genuine care for their welfare, despite the plant's naturally aggressive responses to human contact." Thomas felt a small thrill of recognition. That's exactly what had happened. They'd all been nervous, yes, but also genuinely trying to care for the plants, to repot them properly, to minimize their distress. The mandrakes had somehow sensed that intention. "There's more," Sarah continued, her finger tracing down the page. "Listen to this. Most fascinating is the role of what traditional herbologists have termed the conductor specimen. Invariably, a ghost mandrake whose enhanced sensitivity to magical and emotional energies allows it to serve as an intermediary between human intention and plant response. Without such a specimen present, chorus formation appears to be impossible, regardless of other favorable conditions. So we were lucky, Peter said. Lucky that the ghost mandrake was in our badge. Or Professor Sprout knew it was there, Thomas suggested. She must have noticed it when she was preparing for the lesson. Maybe she was hoping this would happen. Sarah looked thoughtful. That would explain why she seemed surprised but not shocked. Like she was hoping for something, but hadn't expected it to actually occur. They spent the next hour exploring various texts, following references from one book to another, building a picture of mandrake choruses that was both more detailed and more mysterious than what Professor Sprout had explained. They learned that choruses were considered by some medieval herbologists to be sacred events, that certain monastic orders had built their entire practice around trying to cultivate the conditions for chorus formation, and that exactly 0 modern researchers had successfully induced a chorus through deliberate manipulation of variables. It's always spontaneous, Sarah read from another source. Every documented case describes the chorus as emerging unexpectedly, never when researchers were specifically trying to produce one. The moment you try to force it, it becomes impossible, like trying to force yourself to have a specific dream, Thomas mused. The harder you try, the less likely it is to happen. A shadow fell across their table. Thomas looked up to find Diana Rosewood standing there, her expression curious. "I heard you were researching the chorus," she said quietly, mindful of Madame Pince's proximity. "Mind if I join you?" They made room for her, and Diana pulled several additional books from a bag she'd brought. "My mum sent these by Al this morning," she explained. When I told her what happened, I know Professor Sprout said to keep it quiet, but Mum's a professional, and I thought she should know. She practically ransacked her personal library, looking for anything relevant. The books Diana had brought were clearly professional texts, bound in sturdy leather with titles like Emotional Resonance in Magical Flora and Collaborative Plant Consciousness, a field study. One was so old its pages crackled when Diana carefully opened it. "Mom says this is the most important one," Diana said, indicating a slim volume titled The Living Song, a meditation on plant music. It was written by a witch named Beatrice Thorne, who spent 40 years working exclusively with mandrakes. She claimed to have witnessed 5 choruses in her lifetime, which is apparently unprecedented. Thomas pulled the book towards him and began reading. Beatrice Thorne's writing was different from the academic texts, more personal, almost poetic. To hear a mandrake chorus is to understand that consciousness takes forms we cannot imagine from within our limited human perspective. These plants, which we cultivate for their magical properties and tolerate for their usefulness, possess an inner life we barely comprehend. When they sing together, they are not performing for us. They are not trying to communicate with us exactly. They are simply being fully and completely in a way that transcends their usual isolated existence. We are privileged witnesses, nothing more. Something about that passage resonated deeply with Thomas. It matched what he'd felt during the chorus, that sense of being present for something that wasn't about him, that existed independent of human observation or understanding. The mandrakes hadn't been trying to entertain or educate. They had simply been expressing something fundamental about their nature, and the students had been fortunate enough to be present. "Look at this section," Peter said, Pointing to another page in Beatrice Thorne's book, she talks about what happens after a chorus. Says the plants that participated show accelerated growth and increased magical potency. Like the act of singing together makes them stronger, more themselves. Diana nodded. Mum mentioned that. She says any potions made from mandrakes that have participated in a chorus are more effective than normal. The ministry actually keeps records of chorus events because of how valuable those plants become. So our mandrakes are going to be special? Thomas asked. Potentially very special. If they survive to maturity, which takes about 2 years, their roots could be used to make some of the most powerful restorative drafts ever produced. Diana's expression grew more serious. That's another reason Professor Sprout wanted us to keep quiet. If word got out about a chorus, there might be people who would try to acquire the plants. Steal them, I mean. The thought of someone stealing their mandrakes, the small, ugly plants they'd so carefully repotted, that had shared that extraordinary moment with them, made Thomas feel protective in a way that he hadn't quite expected. Those were their plants. They'd handled them, cared for them, been part of their transformation from distressed seedlings to members of a chorus. Professor Sprout would never let that happen, Sarah said firmly, and Greenhouse 3 has serious protective enchantments. I've read about them. Multiple layers of locking charms, intruder detection spells, even a few hexes that would make anyone attempting unauthorized entry regret it considerably. They continued researching, sharing discoveries, and reading passages aloud to each other, building a collective understanding of what they'd experienced. Marcus Webb appeared after a while, drawn by curiosity when he spotted them in the library. Then Timothy Gordon, who'd been studying alone at another table and noticed their gathering. Even a few students who hadn't been in herbology that day, curious about what was capturing so much intense attention, tried to join, but Diana politely deflected them. This was for those who had been present, who had heard the chorus firsthand. By lunchtime, their table was covered with open books, scattered parchment notes, and the accumulated knowledge of centuries of herbological study. Thomas felt his understanding of the event deepening, becoming more nuanced. The chorus wasn't just a neat magical phenomenon or a lucky break. It was the result of complex interactions between plant biology, magical theory, environmental conditions, and, crucially, the emotional and intentional state of the humans present. We helped make it happen, he said aloud, the realization settling into words for the first time, not just by repotting them correctly, but by caring, by approaching the task with genuine respect for the plants as living things, not just magical ingredients or dangerous obstacles. Professor Sprout probably knew that, Sarah said. That's why she's such a good teacher. She doesn't just teach us techniques and safety procedures. She teaches us to care about what we're working with. Diana closed the book she'd been reading and looked at each of them in turn. My mum wants to know if she can come visit the greenhouse, not to interfere or take over or anything like that, but just to see the plants, to confirm they're developing properly after the chorus. She says she'd coordinate everything with Professor Sprout first. That would be brilliant, Thomas said. Maybe she could teach us more about caring for them. I have my first monitoring session with you on Monday, and honestly, I'm a bit nervous about it. What if I miss something important? You won't, Diana assured him. and having Mum consult would definitely help. She's been working with post-chorus mandrakes before. One of the 5 choruses Beatrice Thorne witnessed was at the ministry research facility where Mum works. She knows what to look for. The lunch bell rang, not literally, but rather a subtle shift in the castle's atmosphere that every student somehow sensed, a magical announcement that food was being served in the Great Hall. They gathered there, books and notes, returning borrowed volumes to the shelves and tucking personal texts back into bags. As they walked together toward lunch, their small group of chorus witnesses, Thomas felt a sense of connection that went beyond normal friendship. They shared something now, an experience that had marked them all. And more than that, they shared responsibility for the plants they'd helped transform, for the knowledge they were accumulating, for maintaining the appropriate reverence for what they'd witnessed. The Great Hall was filled with the usual weekend lunch chaos. Students laughing and talking across tables, food appearing in steaming abundance, the enchanted ceiling showing a crisp October sky with fast-moving clouds. But at the Hufflepuff table, where Thomas sat with Peter, and at nearby sections where Diana, Sarah, and Marcus found seats, there was a quality of quiet satisfaction that set them slightly apart. Professor Sprout was at the staff table, deep in conversation with Professor Flitwick about something that required considerable gesturing. Thomas wondered if she was telling him about the chorus, sharing the experience with a colleague. Probably not in detail. She'd asked them to keep it quiet after all. But perhaps the broad strokes, the outline of something remarkable that had occurred in her greenhouse. After lunch, Thomas felt restless, despite the morning spent in sedentary research. He needed movement, fresh air, the physical world instead of books and theories. He convinced Peter to join him for a walk around the grounds, leaving Sarah to continue her research and Diana to write a letter to her mother about the visit to the greenhouse. The October afternoon was crisp and beautiful, the kind of weather that made walking a pleasure. They wandered without particular destination, following paths worn by generations of students, occasionally encountering other Hogwarts inhabitants, a group of first years practicing levitation charms on fallen leaves, Hagrid in the distance working on something near his hut, the giant squid briefly surfacing in the lake before disappearing back into its depths. Eventually, perhaps inevitably, they found themselves approaching the greenhouses. Thomas hadn't consciously planned to come here, but his feet had apparently made decisions his mind hadn't fully registered. The 3 glass structures stood peaceful in the afternoon light, their interiors visible as green shadows through the transparent walls. "Should we go in?" Peter asked. "Check on the mandrakes." "We're not scheduled until Monday," Thomas said, but he was already moving toward Greenhouse 3's door. "But I suppose a quick visit couldn't hurt, just to see how they're settling." The greenhouse door was unlocked, Professor Sprout's way of telling students they were welcome if they chose to visit, though the protective enchantments would prevent anyone with ill intent from entering. Thomas pushed it open, and the familiar warm, humid air enveloped them like a gentle embrace. Inside, everything was quiet. The mandrakes sat in their pots exactly where they'd been left on Thursday, their leaves spread naturally, their growth already visible if you'd looked closely. In just 2 days, they seemed more settled, more established in their new homes. Their roots, invisible beneath the soil, were presumably spreading, taking hold, finding sustenance. Thomas approached his 2 mandrakes slowly, reverently. They didn't react to his presence. No screaming, no writhing, just the peaceful stillness of plants doing what plants do. Growing, existing, being. "Hello," he said softly, feeling slightly foolish, but also feeling it was right to acknowledge them. "It's me, Thomas. I repotted you on Thursday. Just wanted to check that you're doing well." The mandrakes, predictably, didn't respond, but Thomas felt better for having spoken. These weren't just magical ingredients or botanical specimens. They were living things he'd made a connection with. However brief and unusual that connection had been, Peter was examining his own mandrakes with similar careful attention. "They look good," he said. "Healthy. Growing properly, I think. Hard to tell when you've only known them for 2 days, but they seem content." "Content," Thomas agreed. It was the right word. The plants radiated a sense of settled peace that contrasted dramatically with their agitated state during repotting. A sound made them both turn. Professor Sprout stood in the greenhouse doorway, a watering can in one hand, her expression unsurprised. "I wondered if anyone would come by this weekend," she said, moving into the space with her usual comfortable authority. "Students often do, after particularly meaningful lessons. They want to check on the plants, make sure everything's still real." "Is that what we're doing?" Thomas asked. "Making sure it was real." Professor Sprout set down her watering can and came to stand beside them, looking at the rows of peaceful mandrakes. "In part, perhaps, but I think you're also beginning to understand something important about working with living things. Once you've truly connected with a plant, once you've moved beyond seeing it as just an object or an ingredient, you feel responsible for its welfare. You want to check in to make sure it's thriving. That's the mark of a real herbologist." She began moving between the pots, checking soil moisture with practiced fingers, examining leaves for any signs of distress or disease, occasionally adjusting a plant's position to optimize its light exposure. Her movements were so natural, so instinctive, that Thomas realized this was how she probably spent most of her time, simply being present with plants, attending to their needs, maintaining the careful balance between guidance and allowing natural growth. "Professor," Thomas said, emboldened by her presence and the quiet of the greenhouse, "what you said Thursday about the chorus being rare and precious, do you think the mandrakes knew they were doing something special? Or was it just instinct?" Professor Sprout considered this while gently repositioning a plant that had leaned too far toward the light. "That's a question that has occupied botanical theorists for centuries," she said finally. "My own belief, and this is just one witch's opinion, mind you, is that plants exist in a kind of consciousness we can barely understand. Not thinking exactly as we define thinking, but experiencing, responding, being aware of their world in ways that don't require language or abstract thought." She moved to the bench where the ghost mandrake sat, his translucent body catching the afternoon light. "This little one, for instance, I don't think it consciously decided to conduct a chorus, but I do think it felt the care and attention in the room, felt the presence of its fellow mandrakes, felt the possibility of connection, and responded the only way it could, by facilitating communication, by helping transform individual distress into collective expression." Thomas watched the ghost mandrake, remembering how its small body had moved during the chorus, how it had seemed to direct and shape the other plants' voices. Will it ever happen again? The chorus? I don't know, Professor Sprout admitted. That's part of what makes it precious. You can't force it, can't plan for it, can't guarantee it. You can only create the conditions where it might occur, and then hope. Wait. Remain open to possibility. She straightened, brushing soil from her hands. But I'll tell you something that might interest you both. In Beatrice Thorne's writings, which I see you've been researching in the library this morning. Don't look so surprised. Madam Pince and I talk. She mentions that plants which have participated in a chorus sometimes show unusual behaviors months or even years later. Unexpected blooms, unusual growth patterns, moments of what can only be described as visible contentment. They remember, Peter said softly. In their way. Perhaps they do, or perhaps the experience changes them on some fundamental level, the way profound experiences change us. Professor Sprout smiled at them both. Just as I suspect Thursday's lesson changed both of you. You came expecting to learn repotting technique. You left having witnessed something transcendent. That kind of experience shapes how you approach everything afterward. Thomas knew she was right. He'd felt it all weekend. A subtle shift in how he perceived the world around him. A greater awareness of the life and consciousness in things he'd previously overlooked. The house elves who maintained the Hufflepuff common room. The portraits who gossiped in the corridors. The plants throughout the castle, growing in pots and climbing walls and thriving in their various environments. All of it was alive, aware, experiencing existence in forms he could barely imagine. The ghost. Mandrake's leaves moved slightly, though there was no breeze in the greenhouse. Just the faintest sway, like a person shifting in sleep. And Thomas, watching it, felt a swell of affection for the small, fragile creature that had given them all such an extraordinary gift. Thank you, he said quietly, though he wasn't entirely sure if he was thanking Professor Sprout, or the Mandrakes, or the universe in general for arranging circumstances so perfectly, for everything, for the lesson, for sharing your knowledge, for helping us understand what we experienced. Professor Sprout's expression softened with genuine warmth. It's my privilege, Thomas. Truly. Teaching you students, helping you discover the magic in growing things, watching you develop care and respect for living plants. This is why I do this work. Moments like Thursday's chorus are rare, but moments like this, right now, when I see understanding taking root in young minds, these happen more often, and they're equally precious. She picked up her watering can. Now, off with you both. These plants need their rest, and I have work to do. But I'm glad you came. It shows proper respect for what you've been part of. And Thomas, I'll see you and Diana on Monday for your first official monitoring session. Come prepared to learn, and don't be nervous. You're already showing excellent instincts. They left the greenhouse feeling lighter somehow, more grounded. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward evening, painting the castle in warm golden tones. Somewhere in the distance, students were playing Quidditch, their shouts and laughter carrying across the grounds. The weekend continued around them, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. Thomas looked back once at Greenhouse 3, its glass walls glowing in the slanted light. Inside, the mandrakes were growing, their roots spreading through soil enriched by care and magic. And somewhere in Thomas, something similar was happening. roots of understanding spreading deeper, reaching toward light he was only beginning to perceive. Magic, he thought, wasn't just spells and potions. It was this. It was attention and care, creating conditions for impossible beauty. It was being present when rare moments occurred. It was allowing yourself to be changed by what you witnessed. The castle welcomed them back, and Thomas carried the afternoon's quiet revelations with him, like seeds planted deep, already beginning to grow. Monday afternoon arrived with the particular mixture of anticipation and nervousness that came with new responsibilities. Thomas sat through his last class, History of Magic, which Professor Binns taught with his usual droning monotony, barely absorbing anything about the goblin rebellions of the 14th century. His mind kept drifting to the greenhouse, to the monitoring session scheduled immediately after class, to the weight of responsibility for living things that depended on proper care. When Professor Binns finally dismissed them, or rather, when the bell rang and students simply left while the ghostly professor continued lecturing to an empty room, Thomas gathered his things with unusual speed and hurried toward the greenhouse. Diana was already waiting outside Greenhouse 3, her own bag slung over her shoulder, looking considerably more composed than Thomas felt. "Ready?" she asked, smiling at his obvious nervousness. "As I'll ever be," Thomas admitted. "I've been reading about mandrake care all weekend, but there's a difference between reading and actually doing." "There always is," Diana agreed. "But that's why we're starting with monitoring. Observation first, intervention only if necessary. Come on," Professor Sprout said she'd meet us inside. The greenhouse welcomed them with its familiar warmth and the rich smell of soil and growing things. Professor Sprout stood near the central bench, organizing what appeared to be monitoring equipment, small tools, measuring instruments, a large leather-bound journal that looked well used and important. "Ah, excellent timing," she said, looking up with a pleased expression. "Diana, Thomas, welcome to your first proper monitoring session. Come here, let me show you what we'll be doing." They gathered around the bench as Professor Sprout opened the journal to a fresh page. The previous pages were filled with neat handwriting, sketches of plants, careful notations of measurements and observations. This was clearly a record kept over many years, documenting countless plants and their development. "This is the master observation log," Professor Sprout explained. "Every significant plant in my care has entries here: growth patterns, unusual behaviors, responses to different care techniques. Your mandrakes will now have their own section." She turned to a page marked with a ribbon, where she'd already written the date of the repotting and a brief note about the chorus. Thomas leaned closer to read her entry. Thursday, October 10th. Third year class successfully repotted 24 juvenile mandrakes. Unexpected chorus formation facilitated by ghost mandrake specimen, designated GM-1. All plants settled well post-chorus. Beginning regular monitoring protocol with student partners. "You'll make entries each time you visit," Professor Sprout continued. "Nothing elaborate, just observations about growth, any changes in appearance or behavior, soil condition, and any interventions you perform. The goal is to build a complete picture of how these plants develop, especially given their participation in the chorus." She handed Diana a smaller notebook. "This is your working journal. You'll make notes here during each session, then I'll review them and transfer the important points to the master log. That way, You can be as detailed as you like, without worrying about keeping everything perfectly organized. Diana accepted the notebook with visible reverence, running her hand over the leather cover. Thank you, Professor. We'll be very careful with observations. I know you will. Professor Sprout moved toward the rows of mandrakes, gesturing for them to follow. Now, let's begin with basic assessment. What's the first thing you check when monitoring plant health? Leaf condition, Diana answered immediately. Color, shape, signs of wilting or discoloration. Exactly right. Thomas, come look at your mandrakes. Tell me what you see. Thomas approached his two plants, studying them with focused attention. They looked good. He wasn't entirely sure what problems he should be watching for, but nothing seemed obviously wrong. The leaves were a healthy green, spread naturally toward the light, without any visible spots or damage. They look healthy, he said cautiously. The leaves are green and spread out properly. No wilting or brown edges that I can see. Good. More specific. Describe the exact color. Is it bright green, dark green, yellowish at all? Thomas looked more carefully. Medium green. Not bright, but not dark either. Sort of. Solid green, if that makes sense. Professor Sprout nodded approvingly. It does make sense, and you're correct. That's the appropriate color for mandrakes at this stage. If they were yellowish, that would suggest nutrient deficiency. If they were too dark, possibly overwatering. The medium green you're seeing indicates proper health. She handed him a small measuring tape, marked with unusual increments. Now measure the height from soil surface to the tip of the tallest leaf. Be precise. We'll track growth over time, and even small changes can be significant. Thomas positioned the tape carefully, trying to hold it steady while reading the measurement. 7¼ inches, he reported, for the larger one. The smaller one is 6¾ Diana was already recording this in the notebook, her handwriting neat and clear. And the date is October 14th, she murmured, noting everything methodically. Excellent, Professor Sprout said. Now, check soil moisture. Don't just look, feel it. Carefully remove your glove and press your finger into the soil about 1 inch deep. What do you feel? Thomas pulled off his glove and did as instructed, feeling slightly nervous about touching the soil so close to the mandrake. But the plant didn't react. It just sat there, peacefully being a plant. The soil felt slightly damp, cool against his skin, but not wet or muddy. It's moist, but not soggy, he reported. Is that right? Perfect. That's exactly what we want. Mandrakes need consistent moisture, but not waterlogging. Their roots will rot if they're too wet, but they'll dry out and weaken if they're too dry. What you felt is the ideal state. They continued the assessment with each of Thomas's mandrakes, then moved on to Diana's plants. Professor Sprout taught them to check for pests. Though magical greenhouses rarely had problems with ordinary insects, there were occasionally issues with gnomes or other small magical creatures that might damage plants. She showed them how to inspect the underside of leaves, where problems often first became visible. She demonstrated proper technique for testing soil pH with a simple color-changing charm. This is the foundation of plant care, she explained as they worked. Not dramatic interventions or complex spells, but consistent, attentive observation. You learn what's normal for each individual plant, and then you notice immediately when something changes. That's when you can address problems before they become serious. Thomas found himself relaxing into the work. It was methodical, almost meditative, moving from plant to plant, checking each one carefully, making notes, discussing observations with Diana and Professor Sprout. There was something deeply satisfying about the attention it required, the way it demanded he be fully present with what he was doing, rather than letting his mind wander. They reached the ghost mandrake last. It sat on its bench, looking as ethereal as ever, its translucent body catching the afternoon light in ways that made it seem to glow from within. Professor Sprout's manner became even more careful as they approached it. "This one requires special attention," she said quietly. "Ghost mandrakes are more sensitive than their normal cousins, more responsive to environmental changes, more affected by stress, but also more rewarding to work with if you're attentive to their needs." Diana leaned in to examine it, her expression fascinated. "It's so delicate. You can almost see through the stem to the internal structure. Indeed, that translucency is what makes them ghost mandrakes. Their cell walls are thinner, their tissues less dense. It's a genetic variation that makes them physically weaker, but magically more sensitive." Professor Sprout performed her own careful examination of the plant, her fingers gentle as she checked leaves and stem. "How do we know if it's doing well?" Thomas asked. "I mean, with the normal ones, you can see healthy color and growth, but this one already looks so different." "Excellent question. With ghost mandrakes, we watch for luminosity, that internal glow you're seeing. If it dims or flickers, that indicates stress. We also watch for clarity. The translucent quality should be consistent. If parts of the plant become more opaque, that suggests cellular damage or disease." Professor Sprout straightened, looking satisfied. "This one is doing beautifully. The chorus seems to have strengthened it rather than exhausting it, which is a very good sign." She turned to face them both, her expression becoming more serious. "Now, I want to talk with you about something important. Diana, your mother, wrote to me over the weekend. She'd like to visit and consult on the post-chorus development of these plants." Diana nodded. "She mentioned that. I hope it's all right. I know you asked us to keep things quiet, but Mum is a professional, and I thought—" Professor Sprout held up a hand, smiling. "Diana, dear, it's absolutely fine. In fact, I'd welcome her expertise. I've never personally worked with post-chorus mandrakes before, and having someone with that experience would be invaluable. I've already written back inviting her to visit this Wednesday afternoon, if you're both available to be present." "Wednesday?" Thomas felt a flutter of nervousness. Meeting Diana's mother, who was apparently an expert herbologist, felt like a test he hadn't prepared for. "Don't look so worried," Diana said, clearly reading his expression. "Mum's lovely, and she'll be thrilled to meet the students who witnessed a chorus. She's been practically bouncing with excitement since I told her." Professor Sprout chuckled. Indeed, her letter was quite enthusiastic. She's offered to share some of her research on post-chorus development, which could be very valuable for your ongoing care of these plants. I thought it would be educational for you both to be part of that consultation. They finished the monitoring session by checking on several other students' mandrakes, giving Thomas and Diana a broader sense of how the entire cohort was developing. Most plants looked healthy and settled, though a few showed minor signs of transplant stress. slight wilting, or slower growth that Professor Sprout said was normal and nothing to worry about. Some plants take longer to adjust than others, she explained. Just like people, really. Some adapt quickly to change. Others need more time. As long as we monitor them carefully and provide proper care, they'll all get where they need to be. As they prepared to leave, Professor Sprout pulled a small package from a shelf. Before you go, these are for you. Well, for your mandrake specifically, but you'll be administering them. The package contains small vials of clear liquid that caught the light like liquid crystal. Growth supplement, Professor Sprout explained, specifically formulated for post-chorus mandrakes. A few drops on the soil once a week will provide extra nutrients to support their enhanced development. Your mother sent the formula, Diana. Apparently, it's something the ministry has been refining for years. Diana accepted the vials carefully. I'll make sure we apply them properly. Once a week. How many drops? 3 drops per plant, applied directly to the soil near the stem. Not on the leaves. We want it to go straight to the roots. And keep track in your journal of when you apply it and any changes you observe afterward. Thomas watched as Diana carefully tucked the vials into her bag, making notes about the supplement in their monitoring journal. She was so organized, so naturally methodical. He felt grateful to be partnered with her. Her competence made his own nervousness less acute. "You're both doing excellent work," Professor Sprout said warmly. "I can already tell these plants will be well cared for. Now off with you. I'm sure you have homework to attend to, and I have several other students coming for their monitoring sessions this evening." They left the greenhouse together, stepping out into the late afternoon. The October air was crisp and carried the smell of autumn. Wood smoke from Hagrid's hut, fallen leaves, the earthy scent of approaching evening. The castle rose before them, its many windows beginning to glow with candlelight, as enchantments activated against the gathering dusk. "That was brilliant," Thomas said, feeling energized despite the detailed work they'd just completed. "I mean, I was nervous, but actually doing it, checking each plant carefully, making notes, learning what to watch for. It felt really good." Diana smiled. "That's the thing about working with plants. It's calming, isn't it? Grounding. You have to be present, attentive, but it's not stressful the way some magic is. There's no pressure to perform perfectly right now. You're just observing, caring, helping things grow at their own pace." They walked in comfortable silence for a bit. Then Diana spoke again. "I'm glad we're partners for this." Professor Sprout pairs students carefully. She must have thought we'd work well together. "Have you always wanted to work with plants?" Thomas asked. "Like your mum?" Diana considered this. "Not always. When I was little, I found Mum's work kind of boring, honestly. All that patient observation, all those careful notes. I wanted to do exciting magic, transfiguration, charms. Maybe even become an aura." She laughed softly. "But the older I get, the more I appreciate what Mum does. It's not flashy, but it's important. And there's something deeply satisfying about it." Thomas understood exactly what she meant. He'd felt it today in the greenhouse. That sense of doing work that mattered, that connected him to living things and their needs, that required patience and attention, rather than just magical power. They reached the castle entrance and paused. Diana had to return to Ravenclaw Tower, Thomas to the Hufflepuff common room, but neither seemed quite ready to part yet. Wednesday then, Diana said. When Mum visits, I'll meet you here after classes, definitely. And thank you for being patient with me today. I know you probably could have done all that monitoring yourself, but you let me figure things out. We're partners, Diana said simply. That's what partners do. Besides, you did really well. Your observations were careful and detailed. Professor Sprout was impressed. I could tell. Thomas felt warmth spread through his chest at the compliment. See you Wednesday then. He made his way down to the Hufflepuff common room, where Peter was sprawled in their usual spot by the fire, surrounded by what appeared to be every potions textbook in their dormitory. How'd it go? Peter asked, looking up from a particularly complex diagram of cauldron temperature variations. Thomas settled into the chair across from him. It was good. Really good, actually. We measured growth, checked soil moisture, learned about post-chorus care protocols. Diana's mother is coming Wednesday to consult with Professor Sprout about the mandrakes. Fancy, Peter said, impressed. Ministry expert coming to check on plants we repotted. That's pretty extraordinary when you think about it. It was extraordinary, Thomas realized. A week ago, mandrakes had been just another entry in their herbology textbook. Magical plants they'd eventually learn to work with. Now they were living things he felt personally responsible for, that he'd witnessed creating impossible music, that he'd be caring for over the coming months. The common room settled into its evening rhythms around them. Students finishing homework, playing games, talking quietly about their days. The house elves had been by earlier, leaving fresh tea and biscuits on the side tables, their invisible service creating the warm, cared-for atmosphere that made Hufflepuff feel like home. Thomas pulled out his own homework, but found his mind drifting back to the greenhouse, to the careful work of observation and care, to the way Professor Sprout had taught them to truly see what they were looking at, rather than just glancing and assuming. That kind of attention, he realized, could apply to more than just plants. It was a way of being in the world, present, attentive, responsive to what was actually there, rather than what you expected or assumed. His transfiguration essay still needed work. His potions homework wasn't finished, and he had a charms quiz on Friday he should probably study for. The ordinary demands of magical education continued, indifferent to profound experiences in greenhouses. But something had shifted. Thomas felt it settling into place, taking root like the mandrakes spreading through their new soil. He was learning something beyond classroom lessons, learning about care and attention, about responsibility for living things, about the quiet satisfaction of work done well and with genuine purpose. The fire crackled warmly. Peter muttered something about standardized cauldron thickness regulations. Somewhere in the distance, a portrait was singing a bawdy song from the 16th century. The castle breathed around them, alive with centuries of magic and learning, and students growing into themselves. And in Greenhouse 3, 24 mandrakes settled deeper into their pots, their roots spreading, their growth continuing in the darkness and silence. One small ghost mandrake glowed faintly with its internal light, a conductor at rest, waiting for whatever music the world might call forth next. Thomas pulled his parchment closer and began writing his transfiguration essay. But his mind held space for both. The work immediately before him and the larger work of learning to be present, attentive, and caring. The mandrakes had taught him that these things weren't separate. magic and attention, power and patience, extraordinary moments and ordinary care. All of it woven together into something larger than any individual part. He rode steadily as evening deepened into night, the common room warm around him, his friends nearby, and somewhere beyond the castle walls, plants growing in their greenhouse, roots reaching deep, leaves spreading toward light, not yet visible, but coming, always coming, with patient and inevitable grace. Wednesday would bring Diana's mother new knowledge, deeper understanding, but tonight was for homework and friendship and the comfortable rhythms of Hogwarts at peace. Tonight was for letting the lessons of the day settle, for allowing new understandings to take root, for being present with what was, rather than rushing toward what came next. The Mandrakes had sung their chorus. Now came the quieter work of growth, slower, less dramatic, but no less magical for its patience. Thomas understood that now, understood it in his bones, in the careful notes he'd made in Diana's journal, in the way his hands remembered the feel of moist soil and healthy leaves. Magic was flashy spells and dramatic transformations, but it was also this, steady attention, daily care, the long, slow work of nurturing life. Both mattered, both were real, both were worth learning. And Thomas, writing by firelight in a warm common room, felt grateful to be learning both. Wednesday afternoon arrived with a slight drizzle that made the castle feel even cozier than usual, the kind of weather that transformed Hogwarts into a warm sanctuary against the grey Scottish autumn. Thomas finished his charms class, where Professor Flitwick had praised his summoning charm technique, and hurried toward the greenhouse with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. Diana's mother was visiting today, an actual ministry expert, coming to examine plants he'd helped care for. The thought made his palms slightly sweaty despite the cool weather. Diana was already waiting outside Greenhouse 3, but she wasn't alone. Beside her stood a woman who could only be her mother, the same dark hair, the same thoughtful expression, though where Diana had youthful energy, her mother radiated calm competence. She wore practical robes marked with soil stains and carried a worn leather bag that looked like it had seen years of field work. "Thomas," Diana called out, waving him over. "This is my mum, Dr. Eleanor Rosewood. Mum, this is Thomas Whitmore, my monitoring partner." Dr. Rosewood extended her hand, her smile warm and genuine. "It's lovely to meet you, Thomas. Diana's told me so much about you in the chorus. I've been absolutely desperate to see these plants since she wrote." Her handshake was firm, but not intimidating, and Thomas felt some of his nervousness ease. "It's an honor to meet you, Dr. Rosewood. Diana's been brilliant to work with. Please, call me Eleanor. Dr. Rosewood makes me feel ancient, and I'm not quite ready for that yet." She glanced toward the greenhouse with barely contained excitement. "Now, shall we? I've been looking forward to this all week." Professor Sprout emerged from the greenhouse at that moment, her face lighting up when she saw Eleanor. "Eleanor, wonderful to see you again. It's been, 5 years since the botanical conference in Edinburgh?" At least Eleanor agreed, and the two women embraced like old friends. "Though I must say, Pomona, you haven't aged a day. Still got soil under your fingernails, I see." Professor Sprout laughed. "The day I have clean fingernails is the day you should worry about me. Come in, come in. The plants are doing beautifully, but I'm eager to hear your professional assessment." They entered the greenhouse, and Thomas immediately noticed the change in Eleanor's demeanor. She became more focused, her eyes scanning the rows of mandrakes with practiced assessment. Her casual friendliness gave way to professional concentration, and Thomas could see where Diana had inherited her methodical approach to plant care. "Oh my," Eleanor breathed, moving toward the nearest mandrakes. "Look at them. The post-chorus glow is already visible. See how the leaves have that slightly luminescent quality around the edges? That's the enhanced magical saturation beginning to manifest." Thomas looked more carefully at his own mandrakes. Now that Eleanor mentioned it, he could see what she meant. A subtle shimmer around the leaf margins, like they were catching light that wasn't quite visible to ordinary perception. "I noticed they seemed brighter," Professor Sprout said, "but I wasn't certain if it was wishful thinking or actual observation." "Definitely actual." Eleanor pulled a small device from her bag, something that looked like a cross between a magnifying glass and a compass, with several spinning dials. I'd like to take some thaumaturgical readings." "Of course." For the next 20 minutes, Thomas and Diana watched as Eleanor conducted a thorough examination of the mandrakes. She used her device to measure what she called ambient magical density, took careful notes about leaf coloration and stem thickness, and even performed a complex diagnostic charm that made the air around each plant shimmer with colored light, different hues indicating different aspects of magical health. "Extraordinary," she murmured, recording measurements in a notebook similar to the one Diana used. "The thaumaturgical density is already 15% above normal for mandrakes this age. That's consistent with documented post-chorus development. But it's still remarkable to see it firsthand." "What does that mean exactly?" Thomas asked. "The increased magical density." Eleanor looked up, her expression pleased that he'd asked. "Excellent question. Essentially, it means these plants are absorbing and storing more magical energy than normal mandrakes. When they reach maturity and their roots are harvested for potions that increase magical potency or make those potions significantly more effective. A restorative draught made from these mandrakes could potentially revive someone from petrification 30% faster than a standard draft. 30% faster could save lives," Diana said quietly, "in cases where time is critical." "Exactly right." Eleanor moved to the ghost mandrake, her expression becoming even more reverent. "And this one, may I?" Professor Sprout nodded. "Please, I'd value your assessment." Eleanor performed her examination of the ghost mandrake with extraordinary gentleness, her movements slow and deliberate. The device she held seemed to react more strongly to this plant, its dials spinning faster, the colored light it projected more intense. "This is remarkable, Pomona. I've only seen 2 ghost mandrakes in my entire career, and neither was as stable as this one. The chorus didn't just strengthen it, it somehow stabilized its cellular structure. Look here." She pointed to the translucent stem. "The consistency is perfect. No opacity variations, no weak spots. If this plant survives to maturity, and I believe it will, its root could be worth more than all the other mandrakes combined." Thomas felt a surge of protective pride. That small, delicate plant that had conducted the chorus, that had somehow facilitated magic none of them fully understood, was thriving, growing stronger, rather than being weakened by what it had done. Now then, Eleanor said, straightening and addressing Thomas and Diana directly. Professor Sprout tells me you two are the primary monitoring team for these plants. That's a significant responsibility, particularly given their post-chorus status. How are you finding the work? Diana answered first, her response organized and thorough as always. We've established a monitoring routine, checking growth measurements, soil conditions, leaf health. We've started administering the supplement you sent, 3 drops per plant weekly. So far, all the plants are showing consistent positive development. And you, Thomas? Eleanor's gaze was kind but attentive. How are you finding the work? Thomas chose his words carefully. It's different from other magic I've learned. More patient, I suppose. You can't rush it or force it. You just have to pay attention and provide what the plants need. But it feels important, real, in a way that's hard to explain. Eleanor's smile was warm with understanding. You've grasped something essential, Thomas. That's exactly what plant magic is. Patient attention over time, providing consistent care, allowing growth to happen at its own pace. It's not flashy or dramatic most of the time, but it's foundational. Everything in magical herbology builds on that understanding. She turned back to Professor Sprout. They're an excellent monitoring team. The plants are clearly receiving quality care. Have you noticed any unusual behaviors, synchronized movements, responsive reactions to presence? Anything that might indicate residual chorus effects? Professor Sprout nodded slowly. A few small things. The plants seem to orient toward each other slightly, leaves angling as if they're maintaining awareness of nearby mandrakes. Nothing dramatic, but definitely present. And they've been unusually quiet. No screaming at all, even during watering or when the greenhouse is busy with other students. That's consistent with post-chorus literature, Eleanor confirmed. The plants have essentially formed a community, for lack of a better term. They're aware of each other now, connected in ways normal mandrakes aren't. That connection tends to make them calmer, more settled. She moved between the plants, examining several more with her device. I'd like to propose something if you're amenable, Pomona. The ministry has been trying to establish a comprehensive database of post-chorus mandrake development. We have historical data, but it's fragmented. Different researchers in different eras, inconsistent measurement techniques. With your permission, I'd like to include these plants in our current study. It would mean regular check-ins from me, additional monitoring protocols for Thomas and Diana, and documentation of the plant's development from now through maturity. Professor Sprout looked thoughtful. What would that entail for the students? More detailed observations, primarily, instead of weekly monitoring, perhaps twice weekly. Measurements would need to be more precise. They'd learn advanced diagnostic techniques beyond the standard curriculum. Eleanor looked at Thomas and Diana. It would be additional work, but also additional learning. And your names would be included in any resulting publication, student researchers contributing to ministry-level botanical study. Thomas felt his heart leap. Contributing to actual ministry research, having his name in a professional publication. That was beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd nervously approached that first mandrake for repotting. Diana's expression showed similar excitement, mixed with her natural caution. What's the time commitment? We don't want to neglect the plants by being overstretched with other classes. Sensible question, Eleanor approved. I'd estimate an additional hour per week, at most. One extra monitoring session, plus time for the enhanced observations. But if it ever becomes too much, we can adjust. The plant's welfare comes first, always. I'd like to do it, Thomas said, surprising himself with his confidence. If Professor Sprout approves, and if Diana's willing. Absolutely, Diana agreed immediately. This is an incredible opportunity. Professor Sprout's expression was warm with pride. Then you have my blessing. Eleanor, they're all yours. Though I'll still be supervising closely, of course. These are my students and my plants, after all. Naturally, I wouldn't have it any other way. Eleanor pulled several items from her bag. Additional measuring instruments, a small book of advanced observation protocols, and 2 official-looking certificates with the ministry seal. These are for you, she said, handing the certificates to Thomas and Diana. They designate you as student researchers working on an official ministry botanical study. Keep them safe. They're quite prestigious, and they'll look excellent in your academic portfolios. Thomas accepted his certificate with trembling hands. His name was written in elegant script. Thomas Whitmore, student researcher, Department of Magical Botany, post-chorus mandrake development study. Below it was Eleanor's signature and the official ministry seal, shimmering with protective enchantments. This is... He couldn't find adequate words. Well deserved, Eleanor said firmly. You witnessed something rare, and now you're contributing to our understanding of it. That's valuable work, Thomas. Never doubt it. They spent the next hour learning new observation techniques. Eleanor taught them how to use the thaumaturgical measurement device, how to assess magical saturation through specific diagnostic charms, how to document their findings in the detailed format required for ministry research. It was challenging work, requiring concentration and precision beyond what they'd learned so far. But Thomas found himself energized by it rather than overwhelmed. You're both naturals at this, Eleanor said as they practiced the new techniques. Diana, I'm not surprised. You've been around this work your whole life. But Thomas, you have excellent instincts for plant observation. Have you considered pursuing herbology beyond your OWLS? Thomas hadn't, actually. He'd vaguely assumed he'd follow some general magical career path, maybe something in the ministry, or possibly teaching. But now, watching Eleanor work with such obvious love for her subject, seeing how Diana lit up when discussing plant development, feeling his own genuine interest in the mandrake's growth, maybe he should consider it. I might, he said slowly. I never really thought about it before, but I think I'd like to learn more, a lot more. Well, you've got time to decide, Eleanor said. But the field needs people who approach it with genuine care and curiosity. Keep that in mind. As the afternoon wore on, the drizzle outside intensified into proper rain, drumming against the greenhouse roof in a rhythm that was almost musical. Inside, warm and dry, they continued their work, measuring, observing, documenting. Thomas felt himself settling into the flow of it, his initial nervousness forgotten, in the satisfaction of doing careful, meaningful work. Eventually, Eleanor checked her pocket watch and sighed regretfully. I need to get back to the ministry. I have a meeting about venomous tentacular import regulations that I absolutely cannot miss. No matter how much I'd rather stay here with these beautiful mandrakes. She gathered her equipment, but before leaving, she pulled Diana aside for a quiet conversation. Thomas couldn't hear what they were saying, but he saw Diana nod seriously several times, then hug her mother tightly. Eleanor turned to Thomas next, extending her hand. "It's been a genuine pleasure meeting you, Thomas. Take good care of our plants and of my daughter. She has a tendency to push herself too hard in the name of thoroughness." "Mum," Diana protested, but she was smiling. "I will," Thomas promised, "and thank you for everything, for the opportunity, for teaching us so much. The pleasure is entirely mine. I'll be back in 2 weeks for a follow-up assessment. By then, I expect to see even more impressive development." Eleanor turned to Professor Sprout, embracing her warmly. "Thank you, Pomona. This has been extraordinary. I'll send my preliminary report by owl tomorrow. Safe travels, Eleanor. And do visit more often. It's been too long." After Eleanor departed, Professor Sprout turned to Thomas and Diana with an expression of deep satisfaction. "Well then, it seems you two have become official ministry researchers. That's quite an accomplishment for third years. We couldn't have done it without everything you taught us," Diana said earnestly. "All of this, the chorus, the care protocols, understanding how to really observe plants, they all came from your lessons." Professor Sprout's eyes grew slightly misty. "Teaching," she said softly, "is about creating opportunities for students to discover what they're capable of. You two have taken what I've taught and made it your own. That's all any teacher can hope for." She bustled toward the door, clearly trying to hide her emotion. "Now then, it's nearly dinner time, and I'm sure you're both hungry. Off with you. Your next monitoring session is scheduled for Friday afternoon, your first official research documentation session. Come prepared." Thomas and Diana left the greenhouse together, stepping out into the rain. It was cold and sharp, instantly soaking their robes, but neither of them minded. They ran toward the castle, laughing, their ministry certificates carefully protected inside their bags, their minds full of new knowledge and possibilities. In the great hall, dinner was already being served. The enchanted ceiling showed the storm clouds outside, rain apparently falling from the charmed sky before disappearing just above the students' heads. A bit of magical showmanship that never failed to delight. Candles floated overhead, their light warm and welcoming. Against the grey afternoon, Thomas and Diana parted to their respective house tables. But Thomas felt the connection between them had strengthened. They were partners now in something meaningful, bound by shared responsibility and growing friendship that transcended house divisions. Peter was already at the Hufflepuff table, piling his plate with shepherd's pie. He looked up when Thomas arrived, his eyes widening at Thomas's soaked appearance. "Caught in the rain?" "Worth it," Thomas said, pulling his ministry certificate from his bag and showing it to Peter. "Look at this." Peter's eyes went even wider. "You're kidding. Official ministry research? That's incredible." Word spread quickly down the table. Ministry certification was rare for students, especially third years. Thomas found himself surrounded by curious housemates, all wanting to hear about the afternoon, about Eleanor's visit, about the enhanced monitoring protocols. He answered their questions, feeling proud but also slightly overwhelmed by the attention. Sarah appeared at his elbow, having crossed from the Ravenclaw table. "I heard you got ministry certification. That's extraordinary, Thomas. Can I see?" He showed her the certificate, and she examined it with scholarly thoroughness. "This is very prestigious. Most students don't get research certification until they're at least fifth years. if at all. You and Diana must have really impressed Dr. Rosewood. She impressed us more, honestly, Thomas admitted. The amount she knows about post-chorus development, the techniques she taught us, it's beyond anything in our textbooks. That's what real expertise looks like, Sarah said. Textbooks give you foundations, but actual practitioners know all the nuances and exceptions and advanced applications. You're lucky to learn from her directly. As dinner continued, Thomas found himself reflecting on how much had changed in less than a week. He'd gone from being a nervous student, approaching a difficult repotting lesson, to being an official ministry researcher, responsible for documenting plants that might contribute to life-saving potions decades from now. The weight of that responsibility felt significant, but not crushing. Instead, it felt right, like he'd found something he was meant to do, at least for now. After dinner, he returned to the Hufflepuff common room, where a fire crackled welcomingly against the rainy evening. He settled into his favorite chair and pulled out the observation protocol book Eleanor had given them. It was dense with technical terminology and detailed procedures, but as he read, he found himself genuinely interested rather than intimidated. Peter joined him after a while, flopping into the adjacent chair with his own homework. They sat in comfortable silence, occasionally sharing observations or asking each other questions, the common room warm and peaceful around them. Outside, rain continued to fall on the castle and grounds. In Greenhouse 3, 24 mandrakes stood in their pots, their roots spreading deeper, their leaves growing stronger, their enhanced magical properties developing with patient inevitability. One small ghost mandrake glowed faintly in the darkness, a conductor whose work was done, but whose presence remained essential, a living connection between individual plants and their community. Thomas thought about what Eleanor had said, that he had good instincts for plant observation, that he should consider pursuing herbology further. The idea felt both exciting and slightly terrifying. Choosing a path, committing to something specific, meant closing other doors, but it also meant walking through the door you'd chosen with purpose and dedication. He wasn't ready to decide yet. He was only 13, still learning who he was, still discovering what magic called to him most strongly. But he knew now that this, the patient work of nurturing living things, the careful observation that revealed hidden patterns, the satisfaction of seeing growth emerge from consistent care, this resonated with something deep in his character. The mandrakes had sung their chorus, that moment of unexpected beauty that had transformed them all. But the real magic, Thomas was learning, happened in the quiet times between dramatic moments. It happened in daily attention, in hands in soil, in measurements carefully recorded, in growth so slow you could only see it when you look back at where you'd started. Magic was powerful spells and dramatic transformations. But it was also this, showing up consistently, doing the work that needed doing, caring for things that couldn't care for themselves, and trusting that small actions accumulated into significant results over time. The fire crackled. Peter dozed over his potions textbook. Rain drummed against the common room's round windows, and Thomas sat with his observation protocol book, learning new techniques and deeper understanding, feeling grateful for chorus moments, but also for quiet evenings like this, ordinary, peaceful, and somehow containing their own subtle magic. In 2 days, he'd return to the greenhouse for his first official research documentation session. In 2 weeks, Eleanor would return for her follow-up assessment. In months and years ahead, the mandrakes would continue growing, eventually reaching maturity, their enhanced properties making them valuable beyond ordinary measure. But tonight was for this: reading by firelight, friends nearby, rain falling outside, and seeds of understanding taking root within him, growing slowly, reaching deep, becoming part of who he was becoming. The chorus had been extraordinary, but this quiet growth, this patient development, this steady accumulation of knowledge and skill and care, this was magic too. Different magic, slower magic, but no less transformative for its patience. Thomas turned the page and continued reading. The common room warm around him, the castle breathing its ancient magic, and somewhere deep inside himself, something growing, spreading roots, reaching toward light he couldn't quite see yet, but trusted was there, waiting to illuminate whatever he was becoming. The mandrakes had taught him that sometimes the most important growth happens in darkness, underground, where no one can see it. Only later does it become visible. Leaves reaching toward sun, stems strengthening, flowers eventually blooming in their proper season. He was growing too, learning, changing, discovering himself through attention to living things that needed care. And that growth, like the mandrake's growth, would take time, would require patience, would unfold according to its own natural rhythm, not to be rushed or forced. Thomas smiled to himself and kept reading, content to let that growth happen in its own time, trusting in the process, believing in the magic of patient attention and consistent care. Outside, rain fell. Inside, fires burned warm. And in the greenhouse, plants grew in darkness, their roots spreading through rich soil, reaching toward the spring that would eventually come, bringing light and warmth and the fulfillment of every seed's promise to grow, to thrive, to become fully itself in its own perfect time. The warmth of the Hufflepuff common room faded as Thomas closed his observation protocol book and gazed into the dying embers of the fire. Outside, the October rain had softened to a gentle patter against the round windows, each drop catching the candlelight like tiny stars falling to earth. He thought about the journey of the past week, from nervous third-year student approaching a difficult lesson to ministry-certified researcher, responsible for documenting something genuinely rare and precious. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, as if everything had been leading to this moment without him quite realizing it. The mandrake chorus echoed in his memory, not a sound. He couldn't quite recall the exact notes anymore, but as feeling, that sense of being present for something transcendent, of witnessing magic that emerged not from wands or incantations, but from the simple convergence of care, attention, and living things expressing their truest nature. Peter had fallen asleep in his chair, his potions textbook sliding slowly toward the floor. Thomas caught it before it fell, marking Peter's place and setting it gently on the side table. Around them, the common room had emptied as students drifted off to bed, leaving only the soft crackle of cooling embers and the house elves' invisible presence. Fires being banked for the night, cushions being fluffed, the endless quiet service that made Hufflepuff feel like home. In Greenhouse 3, the mandrakes would be settling into their own night rhythms, leaves folding slightly, roots drinking moisture from soil, that enhanced magical saturation Eleanor had measured continuing its slow, patient development. The ghost mandrake would be glowing faintly in the darkness, a small beacon of extraordinary possibility among its more ordinary companions. Thomas had learned something fundamental over these past days, something that would shape how he approached magic and life going forward. That the most profound transformations often came not from dramatic moments, but from consistent, careful attention over time. The chorus had been breathtaking, yes, but the real magic was in the daily work of showing up, observing, caring, nurturing growth in himself, and in the living things entrusted to his care. He rose from his chair, stretching muscles stiff from sitting. The journey down to the dormitory felt different tonight, not just a routine end to another day, but a threshold crossed. He was changed fundamentally, in ways he was only beginning to understand. The seeds of understanding Professor Sprout had mentioned weren't just about plants. They were about patience, about finding rhythm in chaos, about discovering harmony through careful attention to what needed care. As he settled into bed, pulling the warm quilts up against the October chill, Thomas's last thought before sleep was of spring, months away still, but coming inevitably. When it arrived, the mandrakes would be larger, stronger, their enhanced properties more developed, and he would be different too, more skilled, more knowledgeable, more himself. For now, though, it was enough to rest, to let the day's lessons settle into memory, to trust that growth was happening even in sleep, even in darkness, even in moments when nothing seemed to be changing at all. Outside, rain fell gently on Hogwarts, on ancient stones and new growth, on greenhouses holding precious plants and dormitories holding dreaming students. The castle breathed its eternal rhythm, patient and enduring, holding space for countless small magics that would accumulate over time into lives well lived and work well done. And in that space between waking and dreaming, Thomas heard it again, not with his ears, but with that deeper sense that transcended ordinary perception. The faintest echo of the mandrake chorus, singing its wordless song of growth and connection, of individual voices finding collective harmony, of beauty emerging unexpectedly from the careful, patient work of simply paying attention to what mattered. The song faded as sleep claimed him, but its essence remained, a seed planted deep, already spreading roots, reaching toward light not yet visible, but certainly, inevitably coming. In darkness, all things grow. In silence, all things prepare for their becoming. And in the patient attention of those who care enough to watch and wait and tend with genuine devotion, in that space, all things become possible. The mandrakes had taught him that, and Thomas, sleeping peacefully in his Hufflepuff bed, would carry that lesson forward into whatever future awaited him. Roots spreading, leaves reaching, growth happening in its own perfect time.